I don't have anywhere else to go. Annie spoke, her voice catching, though she still tried to keep it clear. Richard Whitmore looked at her over the rim of his half-finished coffee. His face was cold and difficult to read, making Annie's words feel even smaller in the nearly closed cafe. Outside the glass window, rain lashed the sidewalk in sharp silver streaks. Wind drove water under the awning, making the sign above the door tremble again and again. Richard's gaze moved from her wet shoes to the frayed cuffs of her coat, then stopped on the face she was trying so hard to keep calm. "Do you want money?" The question was blunt, not exactly cruel, but cold enough to make Annie's throat go dry. "No, sir." She shook her head at once. "I'm only asking for a place to stay for the night. Even a small corner in a storage room would be fine. I can clean, cook, do laundry, anything. When I find a job and have money, I'll pay rent." Richard did not answer right away. He glanced toward the counter, where the cafe owner was wiping down the register and pretending not to hear. The man had already told Annie twice that he needed to close. "You are asking a man you have never met to let you into his home," Richard said. "I know that sounds strange. Do you?" "Yes, sir. I do." Her fingers tightened around the old laptop pressed to her chest. "But I've run out of people to ask." Richard's phone buzzed on the table. He did not look at it. "I have never allowed a stranger to stay in my house." Annie nodded, as if she had already expected the answer. "I understand. Then you understand my answer." For a moment, Annie looked past his shoulder toward the window. A flash of lightning lit the street in a pale white glare. The rain grew heavier, pounding the pavement, rushing along the gutters, soaking the bus stop sign across the road. When she spoke again, her voice was smaller than before. "Sir, I don't have a room to go back to. I lost my place because I couldn't pay another week's rent. I spent all day applying for jobs. I thought I could stay here until morning, but I don't have enough money to buy anything else. And out there," she stopped. Not because she wanted pity, but because the storm outside finished the sentence for her. Richard followed her gaze to the street. "Then stay in this cafe." Before Annie could answer, the owner stepped out from behind the counter, still holding a cleaning cloth. "I'm sorry, Mr. Whitmore, but she can't. I'm closing in 5 minutes." Richard turned to him. "5 minutes?" "Yes, sir. Water is coming in through the back door, and my wife has already called twice. I feel bad about it, I really do. But this place isn't a shelter. I can't leave anyone inside after I lock up." Annie's face tightened, not with anger, but because she was trying to accept one more door closing without letting it knock her down. "I understand," she said softly to the owner. The cafe owner looked away first. "I'm sorry." Richard rubbed a hand along his chin. For several seconds, there was only the sound of rain, the old refrigerator humming behind the counter, and his phone continuing to buzz on the table. "I'm sorry," he said at last, "but I can't take you home with me." Annie did not move. Richard reached for his coat as if the matter were settled. "My wife would be furious if she found out I brought a young woman home in the middle of the night, and she would have reason to be. It would look improper, dangerous, and careless. I may be many things, Miss Carter, but I am not careless with my family." "I'm not asking to be treated like family," Annie said. "I can stay somewhere no one has to see me. A laundry room, a storage closet, a corner under the stairs. I don't need comfort. I just need somewhere dry until morning." "No," Richard said. The answer landed with the finality of a signature on a document. Annie hugged the laptop tighter. "Sir, please, the storm is too heavy. I don't know where to go. The cafe is closing. I tried shelters, but some were full and others were too far to reach tonight. I don't have enough money for a motel. There isn't another room waiting for me anywhere. I'm not trying to take advantage of you. I just need one night to think clearly about what to do next." Richard's face remained hard, but something in her words unsettled him. "There are places people usually go," he said, his voice harsher than he intended. "Train stations, church steps, under bridges. You are not the first person in Chicago to be caught in bad weather." Behind the counter, the owner stopped moving. Annie did not flinch, but the sentence still reached her. She looked out at the black street, where rainwater ran along the curb and a bus hissed past without stopping. "Under bridges," she repeated very softly. Richard only realized how terrible his words sounded after she repeated them back to him. It had not been advice. It had been a dismissal dressed as practicality. "I didn't mean—" "Yes, sir," Annie said. "You did." The cafe owner set the cloth down and stepped closer, his voice lower now. "Mr. Whitmore, I don't mean to interfere, But this girl really has been sitting here applying for jobs all night. I saw the job sites on her screen. She hasn't bothered any customers. She only asked once in a while if she could charge her laptop a little longer. He looked at Annie, then back at Richard. Maybe you have a guest house, staff quarters, or something like that. I know it's a lot to ask, but she is trying. Annie quickly lifted one hand, as if she did not want to be made more pitiful than the truth. I don't use drugs. I don't steal. I just ran out of rent money. My landlord locked me out this morning. I've sent 27 job applications in 3 days. I only need a chance not to be swept away before someone has time to call me for an interview. The cafe owner's expression changed, but he said nothing more. He had done all he could. The rest was no longer in his hands. Richard looked at the old laptop in Annie's arms. One corner was cracked. The charging cord had been wrapped with tape near the connector. Show me. Annie instinctively pulled it closer. What? If you want me to believe you, show me what you've been doing on it. For a moment, Annie's pride struggled against her need to survive. That laptop was not just a machine. It was her last plan, her last desk, her final proof that she had not given up. Letting Richard look inside meant allowing a stranger to judge how close she was to desperation. But the cafe lights had already dimmed, the owner had the keys in his hand, and the storm outside had not eased. She placed the laptop on Richard's table and turned the screen toward him. Richard expected to see a convenient excuse, maybe a few job pages opened for show. Instead, the screen was crowded with open tabs, temporary staffing agencies, data entry positions, night receptionist shifts, warehouse inventory jobs, bus schedules, lists of cheap rooms for rent, public library hours, resume templates. Behind all of them was a spreadsheet. The spreadsheet made him pause. Everything was listed with painful precision. Food, bus fare, phone bill, laundry, printing resumes, room deposit, amount owed, amount short, estimated weekly income if hired at minimum wage, repayment schedule. No dramatic words, no self-pity, only numbers arranged in rows to keep a life with almost no options from collapsing. Near the bottom of the sheet, one line made Richard look longer. Money to pay back if someone helps me tonight. He read it once, then read it again. You calculated how to repay someone who hasn't even appeared yet. Annie folded her arms across her chest, as if trying to hold herself together. I didn't want to ask unless I knew I could pay it back. Most people in your situation would ask for help first and think about repayment later. I don't want to be like that. It was not arrogance. It was the last thing she still owned. Dignity. Richard looked back at the tabs. You know Excel? A little. This is not a little. I learned at the public library. Free courses. A few short-term data entry jobs too. I understand numbers. And you trust numbers? People can say anything. Annie glanced down at the spreadsheet. Numbers are harder to lie with, if you're patient enough to check them. The cafe owner cleared his throat. Mr. Whitmore, I really do need to lock up. Richard carefully closed Annie's laptop and pushed it back toward her. His face did not visibly soften, but his decision had changed, and Annie seemed to sense it before he spoke. You will not be a guest. Annie's fingers tightened around the laptop. If I let you come with me, you will work. My housekeeper will decide what needs to be done. Cleaning, laundry, kitchen help, organizing storage, whatever she tells you. You will follow the rules. You will not enter private rooms without permission. You will not appear in the living room when I have guests. You will stay in the attic room, not a suite. 6 months, at most. If you find work before then, we will discuss rent, or you will leave. Do you understand? For the first time that evening, Annie looked as if she had almost forgotten how to answer. Then she nodded. Yes, sir. And if I find out you lied to me? I didn't lie. That was not my question. She met his hard tone with a tired sincerity that seemed to make the cafe even quieter. Then you can send me away. But I did not lie. Richard stood and put on his coat. The cafe owner watched them with open concern. Richard took a business card from his wallet and placed it on the counter. She is coming with me, he said. If anyone asks, you saw us leave together. My name and office number are on that card. The owner picked up the card, looked at the name, and suddenly stood a little straighter. Yes, Mr. Whitmore. Annie noticed. When Richard opened the door, the storm immediately pushed cold rain into the cafe. His black car waited by the curb, engine running, headlights cutting through the white curtain of water. Annie paused under the awning, her backpack held tightly against her chest. Richard looked at her. "This is your last chance to decide whether I am too dangerous." Annie looked at the rain, then at the car, then back at him. "You are a danger," she said. But out there are no choices left." Richard gave a short nod, opened the rear door, and waited. Annie climbed into the car with her backpack on her lap and her laptop held close. She did not relax. She did not smile, but she was no longer standing in a cafe about to go dark, with the storm waiting outside the door. As the car pulled away from the curb, Richard's phone buzzed again. The name Martin Blake appeared on the screen. Richard did not answer. In the back seat, Annie opened her laptop just enough to see the spreadsheet. With cold but steady fingers, she added a new line. "Shelter for tonight." Below it, she typed, "Debt to be repaid." The car moved through Chicago in the heavy rain. The windshield wipers worked at full speed, clearing only a blurred patch of glass before the rain covered it again. Annie sat close to the door, both hands clutching her backpack in her lap as if someone might still ask her to hand it over. Her old laptop rested on her knees, the cracked corner pressing against her hand, but she held it carefully. Richard Whitmore sat on the other side of the back seat. The phone in his hand kept lighting up, then going dark again. He did not answer. The driver kept his eyes on the road, guiding the car past flooded sidewalks, closed storefronts, traffic trapped in the rain, and red and green traffic lights smearing across the wet glass. For several blocks, no one said a word. Annie watched the city pass by the window in broken pieces. She kept her knees pressed together, the laptop held close, her shoulders drawn inward with the habit of someone always trying to take up as little space as possible. Richard noticed it without fully turning his head. This girl was not merely sitting in his car. She was trying to prove that she was not a burden, even by the way she existed. Richard's phone buzzed again. Martin Blake's name appeared on the screen, bright and persistent. Richard let the call end. A message arrived almost immediately. "We need to talk before morning." Richard turned off the screen and slipped the phone into his coat pocket. "Do you have identification?" he asked. Annie turned toward him at once. "Yes, sir." "A driver's license?" "Only a state ID. My learner's permit expired." "Do you have any documents proving your most recent address?" "I have rent receipts in my email. And a photo of the rental agreement. It isn't exactly an official lease, but it has the address." Richard looked at her. "Not exactly an official lease? It was a room in a woman's basement, paid in cash every week, no separate mailbox. The outside door didn't have a lock either." Annie stopped, as if realizing she had said too much. "But I have enough proof to show I stayed there. My housekeeper will make copies of the documents tomorrow morning." "Yes, sir. You will give her your full name, phone number, previous address, and emergency contact." Annie was silent for a beat. "I don't have an emergency contact." Richard turned toward her. "No one? No one I should put on any papers." The answer settled between them. Richard did not press further. He had seen enough broken families, hidden debts, and names people avoided to know that sometimes silence told a story more clearly than any explanation could. "Then leave that line blank," he said. "Thank you. This is not a rescue story, Miss Carter. I want you to understand that before we arrive at the house, I am not taking responsibility for some noble ideal. I am not opening my home because I suddenly became generous in a cafe. You asked for shelter. I am offering shelter with conditions." "I understand. Repeat the conditions." Annie looked at him, unsure whether he was testing her memory or reminding her of her place. Either way, his face gave her no comfort. "I will work under your housekeeper's supervision, cleaning, laundry, helping in the kitchen, organizing storage, whatever she assigns me. I will not enter private rooms unless I have permission. I will not appear in the living room when you have guests. I will stay in the attic room, not a guest room, 6 months at most. If I find work before then, we will discuss rent, or I will leave. And if you lie, you can send me away. If you steal, I don't steal." "That is not an answer." Annie looked straight at him. "If you believe I have stolen something, you can call the police. But I will not give you a reason to do that." The driver's eyes flicked briefly to the rearview mirror, then returned to the road. Richard noticed, but said nothing. Annie answered like someone who was used to being suspected before she had done anything wrong. "Good," Richard said. Annie turned back to the window. Rainwater ran in crooked lines down the glass, turning the city into something distant and blurred. After a while, she asked softly, Does your wife know I'm coming? No. Her shoulders tightened. Then maybe I shouldn't do this. It is a little late to stand in the rain and practice better judgment. I don't want to cause trouble in your house. Richard's eyes grew a little colder. You will not meet my wife tonight. She has already gone upstairs. Helen will arrange everything. Tomorrow morning, I will tell my wife that I hired temporary help in an emergency. Is that what I am? For tonight, yes. Annie looked down at the laptop on her knees. Will she be angry? Yes. Then I'm sorry. Do not apologize for things you did not decide. She looked at him again, surprised by the sentence. It was not warm, but it was fair. And fairness had been so rare lately that she did not know how to receive it. The car left the downtown area. The lights grew fewer. The glass buildings disappeared behind them, giving way to quieter roads, higher walls, and gates with cameras. Annie noticed the security cameras near the entrance, the motion sensor lights on the garage, and the long driveway leading toward a place that needed no explanation to prove it belonged to someone very wealthy. When the car turned through the iron gate, she sat up straighter. At the end of the drive, the Whitmore estate emerged from the rain, large and pale beneath the outdoor lights. It was not the largest building Annie had ever seen, but it was the first private home that made her feel as though a person could vanish inside it, and no one would find them unless someone with authority allowed it. Warm light spilled from a few windows. Rainwater streamed steadily from the gutters. The car stopped beneath the covered entrance, and the driver stepped out with an umbrella. Richard opened his own door before the driver could come around. Bring her things in. I can carry them, Annie said quickly. Richard looked at the backpack still clutched against her chest. Not that. She understood at once. He had not meant it as an insult. The backpack was not merely luggage. It was something she was not yet ready to let out of her hands. The front door opened before they reached the steps. Helen Morris stood in the doorway, wearing a gray cardigan over a neat shirt, her silver hair pinned tightly at the back of her head. Her gaze moved from Richard to Annie, then to the old laptop, the faded backpack, and the soaked shoes. Mr. Whitmore, Helen said. Mrs. Whitmore went upstairs half an hour ago. Good. Helen, this is Annie Carter. She will be staying in the attic room for a while. Temporary help, 6 months at most. She works under your supervision. Helen did not ask why at the door. She simply stepped aside. Come in, Miss Carter. Careful on the rug. Your shoes are wet. Annie stepped inside and stopped almost immediately. The foyer was larger than the room she had lost that morning. A dark wooden table stood against the wall, with a lamp and a bowl for keys on top. Framed photographs lined the staircase, faces belonging to a world she knew had no place for her. I can clean the floor, she said, looking down at the watermarks near her shoes. You can clean tomorrow, Helen replied. Tonight, you should take off that coat before it chills you to the bone. Annie obeyed. Helen handed her a towel, then looked at Richard. Backstairs? Yes. No staff gossip. Helen's mouth tightened. Staff gossip spreads when people do not know what to think. Sir. Richard accepted the correction without argument. Then tell them exactly what I just told you. Miss Carter is temporary help. She works under you. Nothing more. Understood. Annie followed Helen down a narrow hallway, away from the main staircase and the larger rooms. She kept looking around, though not too obviously. She memorized exits, corners, stairs, and places where someone might suddenly appear. Helen noticed. You do not need to memorize escape routes tonight. Annie's face stiffened. I'm not. You are. But it's all right. Some people count windows when they enter a room. Some people count silver. I prefer the first kind. Helen opened a door, leading to a narrower staircase. You will use these stairs unless told otherwise. The kitchen is downstairs. Laundry room at the end of the hall. Pantry beside it. Mr. Whitmore's library is on the second floor, but you will not enter until I allow it. Breakfast begins at 6. We work before the rest of the house wakes up, if possible. Yes, ma'am. Helen glanced back at her. You speak as if you have worked in several places before. I have. Housework? Some. Cleaning. Food prep. Laundry. Mostly places that paid in cash. Cash makes people careless with records. I keep my own. Good. I like records. At the top of the stairs, Helen opened a low door into a small attic room. The ceiling sloped on one side. There was a narrow bed, a desk, a lamp, a wooden chair, and a window blurred by rain. A folded quilt lay at the foot of the bed. There were no decorations, but everything was clean. It isn't much, Helen said. Annie stepped inside carefully. It's dry. The older woman looked at her for a moment, and the sternness in her face softened slightly. Bathroom is 2 doors down. Towels are in the linen closet. Do not use the blue towels. Those are for guests, and you are not a guest. Annie nodded. Yes, ma'am. I do not say that to insult you. Guests sit and wait to be served. Staff know where things are and how to be useful. In this house, useful people tend to last longer. I can become useful. We meet at 6:15. Not 6:30? Helen raised an eyebrow. You heard me. 6:15, Annie repeated. Helen pointed to the lock. It works from the inside. Use it if it helps you sleep. Annie looked at the small brass latch, then back at Helen. Yes, I will bring food up. You don't have to do that. I did not ask whether I had to. Helen left before Annie could thank her again. Annie set her backpack on the chair, placed her laptop on the desk, and stood in the middle of the room. The storm beat hard against the roof, but to her, this was 4 walls, a bed, a working lock, and no voice telling her she had 5 minutes left to leave. If Annie's quiet strength in this small attic room touched your heart, please like this video. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from, because someone near you may be feeling this story too. And if you want more emotional and inspiring stories like this, please subscribe to the channel. She took off her wet shoes and lined them neatly beside the door. Then she opened her backpack and checked what she still had. 1 change of clothes, a plastic folder of documents, a small bottle of lotion, a comb, a phone charger, 2 granola bars, and a library card. Everything she owned could fit under one arm. She packed it all again in the same order, as if as long as that order did not change, her life had not completely fallen apart. There was a knock at the door. Annie froze, then crossed the room. Yes? It's Helen. Annie opened the door. Helen held a plate with a turkey sandwich, a few apple slices, and a cup of hot tea. Eat all of it. I can save some for tomorrow. No, tomorrow will have food of its own. Annie took the plate with both hands. Thank you. Helen watched her. Mr. Whitmore is not an easy man. I guess that. He is not a cruel one either, though sometimes he tries very hard to look like one. Annie almost smiled, but the night still felt too long for her to allow herself that much relief. I won't forget where I am. Good, but do not shrink so much that you cannot work. I do not need trembling hands. After Helen left, Annie locked the door. The click was very small, but it changed the room. She sat at the desk and ate slowly, the way she had learned to eat when she needed a meal to last. When she had finished half the sandwich, she remembered Helen's tone and ate the rest. The tea warmed her hands before it warmed her throat. Then she opened her laptop. The battery light blinked red. She found an outlet beside the desk, plugged in the taped charging cord, and adjusted it until the charging light finally came on. Her spreadsheet opened to the last line she had added in the car. Shelter for tonight. Debt to be repaid. She clicked into the next cell and typed carefully. Attic room. Food. Dry shelter. Start work at 6:15. Follow rules. Keep records. Do not get careless. She stopped at the last line, looked at it for a moment, then added nothing more. Downstairs, Richard stood alone in the foyer, his coat still damp at the shoulders. Helen returned from the back stairs and waited until he saw her. She will work, Helen said. You saw that already? I saw that she is hungry, tired, and proud. That combination either breaks a person or tempers them. Richard looked toward the staircase. Who is she? Helen folded the damp towel over her arm. Too early to say, but she thanked me for a room most of the guests in this house would complain about. Richard's phone buzzed again. Martin Blake. He looked at the name, then turned the phone off. Helen noticed. Trouble at the office. There is always trouble at the office. An answer like that usually means yes. Richard did not reply. He started toward his study, then stopped. If my wife asks tonight, tell her I will explain in the morning. She will not like that. No. And if she asks why a young girl is sleeping under her roof, Richard's face remained calm, but the question did not pass him by. Tell her the truth. The storm was too severe. The cafe was closing, and I made a decision. Helen nodded. That may be the simplest sentence you have said all week. Richard looked at her with tired eyes. Good night, Helen. Good night, sir. Richard entered his study and closed the door. On his desk lay the financial reports he had brought home from the company. He sat down but did not open them right away. Instead, He thought about the spreadsheet on Annie's cracked laptop. Food, bus fare, phone bill, repayment if someone helps me tonight. A girl with almost nothing had accounted for every dollar she spent, down to the last line. And his company, with billions of dollars moving through it every year, suddenly could not clearly explain where part of its money had gone. The thought bothered him because it was too simple, too sharp, and too true. He reached for the top folder, then stopped when his phone lit up again. Martin Blake. This time, Richard answered. Richard, Martin said, his voice low and smooth, as if he had been waiting patiently on the other end of the line for a long time. I'm starting to worry. Don't. We need to handle this before morning. Evelyn is anxious, and David is asking questions that could make the board uncomfortable. The board is already uncomfortable. That is exactly why you need to let me handle the numbers. There are lingering expenses from older operations. Nothing illegal. Nothing that cannot be explained. Richard watched the rain strike the window of his study. Is that so? A brief silence fell on the other end. What? Then explain it. Martin gave a soft laugh. Of course, that's what I've always done. Richard did not answer right away. Upstairs, somewhere under his roof, Annie Carter was probably adding another line to that strange spreadsheet of hers. Down here, the man he trusted most was telling him not to worry. For the first time that night, those two things no longer fit together. I'll see you in the morning, Richard said. Richard, we should talk tonight. We just did. He ended the call and placed the phone face down on the desk. Then Richard sat motionless for a long time in the dark study, listening to the rain and staring at the folders in front of him. At 6:14 the next morning, Annie stood at the kitchen doorway with her hair pulled back, her shoes dry but still stiff from the storm, and her backpack hidden under the attic bed because carrying it downstairs would have made her look ready to run. She had slept less than 3 hours. The room had been quiet, the door had locked from the inside, and still her body had stayed alert as if rest were something that needed permission. Helen Morris was already at the stove, turning bacon with one hand and checking a small notebook with the other. The kitchen was larger than the cafe from the night before. Copper pans hung above a butcher block island. A coffee maker hissed near the wall. 2 trays sat ready with folded napkins, sliced fruit, toast, and small dishes of butter. It looked like a room designed to feed a family that rarely sat down together. Helen glanced at the clock. 1 minute early. I didn't want to be late. That is usually how one avoids it. Helen pointed to the sink. Wash your hands. Then start with the cups on that shelf. Mr. Whitmore takes black coffee. Mrs. Whitmore takes tea with lemon. No sugar. Unless she is upset. If she is upset, she still says no sugar. But she wants honey beside the cup. Annie washed her hands and dried them on the towel Helen indicated. How do I know if she's upset? Helen gave her a look. She is married to Mr. Whitmore. Assume she has reason. Annie almost smiled, then stopped herself and reached for the cups. Helen saw the effort but did not comment. Instead, she watched the way Annie moved. Careful, quiet, too careful with expensive things. People who had never owned much often handled other people's property as if a plate could decide their future. The cups are not made of glass bones, Helen said. Hold them like dishes, not evidence. Yes, ma'am. Better. By 6:30, Annie had learned where the mugs were kept, which drawer held the linen napkins, how to load the dishwasher without making Helen correct her twice, and why the silver tray near the pantry was not for breakfast because, as Helen put it, some trays are for carrying food, and some are for reminding guests they are being judged. Annie did not ask whether that was a joke. She had a feeling Helen preferred people to wonder. A housekeeper named Marla came in through the rear entrance, shaking rain from her umbrella. She stopped when she saw Annie. Who's this? Miss Carter, Helen said. Temporary help. She works under me. Marla looked Annie up and down with open curiosity. Temporary like 2 days temporary? Or temporary like somebody rich felt guilty? Helen set down the tongs. Temporary like none of your business before breakfast. Marla raised both hands. All right. Good morning, Miss Carter. Good morning, Annie said. It was the first normal greeting she had received in the house, and for some reason it made her chest tighten more than suspicion had. She placed cups on the tray and followed Helen's instructions without adding a word. At 7, Richard entered the kitchen in a dark suit, phone in hand, face already set for the day. He looked as if he had been awake longer than Annie. The lines near his mouth were deeper than they had been in the cafe, and the phone seemed to belong in his hand the way a weapon might belong in another man's. Helen poured his coffee. Breakfast in the small dining room? Study, Richard said. Helen's mouth tightened. Mrs. Whitmore requested breakfast upstairs. Richard paused. She knows? She knows there is someone new in the house. She asked if you had lost your mind before or after midnight. Annie lowered her eyes to the tray. Richard did not look embarrassed, but something in his jaw changed. I'll speak with her. I imagine you will. Helen handed Annie the coffee. Take this to the study. Down the hall, second door on the left. Knock once. Enter if he answers. Set the cup on the coaster. Do not touch the papers. Richard turned toward Annie. You remember the rules? Yes, sir. He walked out first. Annie followed several steps behind, carrying the cup with both hands until Helen's voice reached her from the kitchen. Like a dish, Miss Carter. Annie adjusted her grip. The hallway was quiet except for the low sound of rain against the windows. She reached the study door and knocked once. Come in. Richard was already behind the desk. Files were spread across the surface in neat but heavy stacks. Some had colored tabs. Some bore the Whitmore Global logo. A legal pad sat open beside his phone, and on the top page Annie saw 3 words written in firm black ink before she made herself look away. Vendor cost review. She set the coffee on the coaster. Richard noticed the small discipline of her gaze. You read fast. I didn't read it. You saw it. I saw words. I didn't study them. There's a difference? Yes, sir. He took the coffee. Good. Keep knowing that. Annie turned to leave, but he stopped her. Helen says you'll be in the library this morning. If she says so. You'll dust shelves, sort old magazines, and move boxed files to the cart outside the door. If a box is sealed, it stays sealed. If it is marked for disposal, it still stays closed until Helen tells you otherwise. Understood? Yes, sir. And Miss Carter? She looked back. My wife may speak to you today. Annie's fingers tightened at her sides. What should I say? The truth. Briefly. That I asked you for help? That I was foolish enough to provide it? There was no warmth in the answer, but there was no shame placed on her either. Annie nodded. Yes, sir. When she returned to the kitchen, Helen had already set aside a small plate for her. Scrambled eggs, toast, and a few pieces of bacon. Annie looked at it, then at Helen. Eat, Helen said. I can work first. You can eat first. Hungry people drop things. Annie sat at the end of the small staff table. Marla poured herself coffee and leaned against the counter. So, Miss Carter, where are you from? Annie kept her answer simple. South Side. Family there? Helen looked up sharply. Marla caught it and changed direction. You know laundry machines? Yes. Good. The fancy ones in this house have more moods than my ex-husband. Don't touch the wool setting unless Helen gives you a blessing. Annie took a bite of toast and finally allowed the smallest smile. After breakfast, Helen took her upstairs to the library. The room smelled of paper, furniture polish, and old smoke that had settled into the walls long before Annie arrived. Books covered 3 sides from floor to ceiling. A heavy desk stood near the windows. Cardboard boxes lined one wall, labeled by year and department. Annual reports, donor events, vendor files, retired operations, disposal. Helen opened the curtains halfway, letting in gray morning light. This room is Mr. Whitmore's pride and his bad habit. He keeps too much and remembers too little. Start with the shelves by the window. Dust top to bottom. Then these magazines go by year. The boxed files stay as they are unless I open them. Yes, ma'am. Do not rush. Rushing is how people break things and pretend they found them that way. Annie began with the shelves. The work was simple but not mindless. She removed a small row of books, dusted, replaced them in the same order, then moved to the next. Some were business biographies. Some were histories of railroads, shipping routes, Chicago politics, American industry. Richard Whitmore, she realized, had studied empires before building his own. By late morning, Helen opened the first few boxes and told Annie to separate loose papers from bound reports. Anything with a paper clip goes here. Anything bound goes there. Anything with a sticky note stays flat. Annie worked quietly. The dates on the files stretched back years. Whitmore Global had not always looked like the giant she knew from news articles. Early letterheads were plain. Some reports had coffee marks. Some margins had Richard's handwriting, sharper and more impatient than his voice. As she lifted a stack from a box marked Retired Operations, A folder slipped loose and spread several pages across the rug. Annie froze. Helen, across the room, did not turn. Pick them up in order. I'm trying. Not trying. Doing. Annie knelt and gathered the pages carefully. She did not read, but numbers caught her the way moving light catches the eye. Vendor summary. Regional routing. Administrative services. Quarterly cost adjustment. The same phrase appeared 3 times on the top sheet, each with a different amount and the same vendor name. Northlake Administrative Services. Her hand slowed. Helen noticed this time. Something wrong? Annie placed the papers back together. No, ma'am. Helen crossed the room and held out her hand. Annie gave her the folder. Helen glanced at the label and set it in the pile marked disposal. Old operations paperwork. Mr. Whitmore insists on saving things until they become useless, then asks why the house has no storage. Annie nodded, but the name had lodged in her mind. Northlake. She had heard it the night before, in Richard's phone conversation, then again in the cafe when his messages lit the screen, or maybe she had only seen it briefly in the study. She could not be sure. She only knew the word felt familiar in the way a repeated number felt familiar before the pattern revealed itself. By noon, Mrs. Whitmore came downstairs. Annie heard her before seeing her, heels on the hall floor, measured and controlled. Helen straightened slightly, not from fear, but from experience. A woman appeared in the library doorway, elegant in cream slacks and a pale sweater, her hair cut neatly at her shoulders. Her face was composed, but her eyes went directly to Annie. "So this is the emergency arrangement," she said. Helen answered before Annie could. "Mrs. Whitmore, this is Miss Carter. She is helping me temporarily." Mrs. Whitmore stepped into the room. "I was told she came from a cafe in the middle of a storm." Annie stood. "Yes, ma'am. And you asked my husband to bring you here?" Annie held her hands still. "I asked him for a safe place for the night. He offered work with conditions." Mrs. Whitmore studied her for a moment. "Do you understand how this looks?" "Yes, ma'am." "Do you understand how generous people can become targets?" "Yes, ma'am." "And do you understand that I do not know you?" Annie nodded. "You shouldn't have to trust me because I'm standing in your house. I'll follow the rules. And if you want me gone, I'll leave." Helen's face did not change, but her eyes moved briefly to Annie. Mrs. Whitmore seemed prepared for excuses, maybe tears, maybe anger. Annie gave her none of those. The older woman looked toward the file piles, then back at Annie. "Helen is in charge of you." "Yes, ma'am. If she says you leave a room, you leave it. If she says you stop touching something, you stop. You do not go looking through this house for a story to sell or a weakness to use." "I won't." Mrs. Whitmore looked at her coat folded over the chair, the old laptop bag near the door, the careful stacks Annie had sorted. "We'll see." She left as quietly as she had arrived. Annie let out a breath only after the footsteps faded. Helen returned to the files. "You handled that well. I don't think she likes me. She doesn't know you. There is a difference. Keep working." Annie obeyed. But when she reached for the next stack, her eyes found the disposal pile again. Northlake Administrative Services sat halfway down, hidden under old reports and yellowing memos. She did not touch it. Not yet. Downstairs, Richard stood outside the study with his phone at his ear, listening to Martin Blake explain that the board needed calm, confidence, and a unified message before the next financial review. Richard gave short answers, the kind that let another man keep talking. His mind, however, was not fully on the call. It had drifted to a spreadsheet built on a cracked laptop, a girl who counted repayment before receiving help, and an old vendor name he had begun hearing too often. In the library above, Annie sorted papers under Helen's supervision, moving one document at a time, saying nothing, but the name stayed with her. Northlake. Some words were ordinary until they returned twice. Then they became a question. By mid-afternoon, Annie had learned that the Whitmore house did not move like a home. It moved like a company with carpets. Every task had a quiet order. Every hallway had a purpose. Every room seemed to know who was allowed to enter and who was expected to stay out. Helen Morris did not explain these rules with speeches. She gave Annie a stack of linen napkins and said, "Fold them this way." She handed her a basket and said, "Guest towels, not family towels." She pointed to the second-floor hall and said, "If that door is closed, you knock. If no one answers, you do not try the handle." Annie followed each instruction and kept a list in her head. She already had too much written down in her laptop to risk anyone thinking she was keeping notes on the house. The more she saw, the more she understood that surviving here would require something different from surviving outside. Outside, she had learned to move quickly, carry little, and avoid questions. Here, she had to move slowly, touch nothing twice, and answer questions before people decided she was hiding something. Helen gave her a dry black skirt and a white blouse from a storage closet near the laundry room. "Temporary uniform," she said. "It may not fit well, but it is clean." Annie held the clothes carefully. "Thank you, ma'am. You can thank me by not ironing it while wearing it. Someone actually did that once." Annie blinked. Why would someone do that? Because pride and common sense do not always eat at the same table. Helen handed her a pair of plain black flats. "Try these. If they pinch, tell me before you start limping. I do not need silent suffering in my kitchen." The shoes were half a size too large, but Annie said they were fine because fine was easier than needing more. Helen looked down at her feet, then opened a drawer and took out 2 heel grips still in the package. Fine is not the same as fitted. "Sit." Annie sat. Helen placed the grips inside the shoes and passed them back. "Better?" "Yes, ma'am." "Good. Now we will see if you can follow instructions when someone rich is in a bad mood. Is that common? In this house? It comes with the furniture." Helen sent her to the second-floor hall with a cloth, polish, and instructions to clean the small table outside Richard's library without touching the framed photographs. The rain had thinned, but the sky remained gray, pressing dim light against the tall windows. Annie worked slowly, polishing the table in straight lines. Careful around a silver picture frame, turned slightly toward the wall. She did not adjust it. The house had enough eyes without her moving things. From behind the library door, Richard's voice came through low and tight. "No, Martin, I'm not giving them a statement based on language I haven't approved." A pause. "Because the last time I let someone smooth over an internal matter, I ended up with 3 board members calling my personal attorney before breakfast." Annie kept moving the cloth, though the table was already clean. Richard's voice dropped further, but one phrase came through clearly. "Northlake is not a rounding error." Her hand stopped for half a second, then resumed. Northlake again. The door opened suddenly. Annie stepped back at once, cloth in hand. Richard came out with his phone at his side, eyes narrowed from the call he had just ended. He noticed her near the table. "What are you doing?" "Cleaning, sir. Helen told me to polish this table." His gaze moved to the cloth, the polish, the untouched photographs. "Did you hear my call?" "I heard your voice." "That is not what I asked." "I heard some words. I didn't listen for them." Richard's jaw tightened. Convenient distinction. "It is the truth." He held her there with silence. Annie did not feel it. People with power often waited for nervous people to explain too much. She had learned that every extra sentence could become a hook. Richard glanced at the table. "You didn't move the frame." Helen said not to touch the photographs. "Most people would straighten it." "I'm not here to improve your house, sir. I'm here to follow instructions." For the first time that day, the hard line of his mouth shifted, not into a smile, but into something less severe. Helen will like that answer. "I hope so. She does not like easily." "I noticed." A voice came from the stair landing before Richard could answer. "And yet I hear everything." Helen appeared with a basket of folded towels against her hip. She looked from Richard to Annie, then to the polished table. "That surface has been clean for 3 minutes, Miss Carter. If you keep rubbing, you will apologize to the wood." "Yes, ma'am." Annie lowered the cloth. Richard checked his phone again, then looked at Helen. "Martin is coming by at 6. Helen's face changed by a careful inch. "For dinner? For a private meeting? Does Mrs. Whitmore know?" "She will." Helen's silence carried an entire opinion. Richard ignored it. "No one enters the front sitting room while he is here. Coffee only. No dinner service unless I ask." Helen nodded. "Understood." Richard turned to Annie. "That includes you, especially you." "Yes, sir." His phone rang again. He walked back into the library and closed the door. Helen watched Annie fold the cloth over her hand. "When Mr. Blake arrives, you stay in the service hall unless I send you somewhere." "Who is he?" Helen began walking, and Annie followed with the polish. "Mr. Whitmore's oldest business partner, co-founder of Whitmore Global. He has been coming to this house longer than some of the staff have been alive." "Do you like him?" Helen gave her a side look. "That is not a staff question." "I'm sorry." "No, you are curious." Curiosity is useful if it wears a leash. Helen stopped outside the linen closet. Mr. Blake is polite. He remembers birthdays. He sends flowers when someone is sick. He thanks the kitchen by name. People like that can be either genuinely considerate or very practiced. Annie absorbed that. How do you tell the difference? Time, pressure, and whether they are still kind when kindness no longer buys them anything. That sentence stayed with Annie through the rest of the afternoon. She scrubbed the laundry sink, sorted towels, wiped pantry shelves, and learned that Mrs. Whitmore preferred her tea brought on a small tray with lemon on the side, not floating in the cup. Mrs. Whitmore did not speak to Annie again. But once, passing through the rear hall, she paused long enough to see Annie kneeling beside a basket of linens. "Helen says you know your way around numbers," Mrs. Whitmore said. Annie stood. "Some numbers, ma'am. My husband is impressed by unusual things when he is tired. Do not mistake that for trust." "I won't." Mrs. Whitmore studied her answer. "Good." She walked away before Annie could say more. At 6, the house changed. Helen checked the coffee service twice. Marla disappeared into the laundry room with instructions not to cross the main hall. Annie stood in the service corridor holding a tray of clean cups, listening to the front door open. Martin Blake's voice came in smooth and warm. "Helen, you look younger every time I see you," Helen answered with perfect manners. "And you tell that lie better every year, Mr. Blake." He laughed, easy and familiar. "Where is he?" "In the front sitting room." Annie saw him only briefly as he passed the gap between the service hall and the main corridor. Martin Blake was tall, silver-haired, dressed in a navy suit that fit without calling attention to itself. He carried no umbrella, though the rain had not fully stopped. Someone else must have handled it before he reached the door. He moved through the house as if he had earned every inch of it. Then his eyes flicked toward the service hall and found Annie. It lasted less than a second, but she felt the measurement in it. Not surprise. Not curiosity. Inventory. He saw the uniform, the shoes, the old laptop bag tucked near the kitchen bench, the new face in a house that rarely changed. Then he smiled. "You must be new," he said. Annie held the tray steady. "Yes, sir. Helen runs a tight ship." "You'll learn a lot if you listen." Helen stepped between them with the coffee pot. "Mr. Whitmore is waiting." "Of course." Martin's smile stayed in place as he continued down the hall. Annie looked at Helen after he passed. Helen did not look back. "Breathe later. Cups now." Richard and Martin spoke for nearly an hour in the front sitting room. Annie did not enter. She remained in the service hall, polishing already clean spoons because Helen had told her that idle hands made people ask questions. The door was not fully closed. Annie heard only broken pieces. "Legacy vendor structure," Martin said. Richard's voice followed. "Then why is David asking for a deeper review?" "Because lawyers are paid to worry." "And Northlake?" A pause, small but present. "Administrative support from an old routing expansion," Martin said. "You approved the structure years ago. I approve many things. That does not mean I remember this one. That is why you have me." Helen's hand stopped above the coffee tray. Annie saw it. Just one brief pause before the older woman lifted the sugar bowl and set it down again. Martin continued, voice still calm. "Richard, you are exhausted." The board smells hesitation. "Let me settle the language. Calm Evelyn, and keep David from turning a manageable issue into a spectacle." Richard did not answer loudly enough for Annie to hear. A few minutes later, the bell rang from the sitting room. Helen lifted the coffee tray, then looked at Annie. "You come with me, but you do not speak unless spoken to. Set the cups on the side table and leave." Annie nodded. Inside the sitting room, the air smelled of coffee, rain-damp wool, and expensive bourbon. Richard stood near the fireplace with one hand in his pocket. Martin sat in an armchair, relaxed, one ankle crossed over the other. His face brightened when Helen entered. "Thank you, Helen." Annie set the cups down carefully. She kept her eyes on the tray, but the papers on the low table were close enough for one heading to catch her attention. Northlake Administrative Services. Below it, in smaller type, Quarterly Operations Adjustment. Her fingers tightened around the empty tray. Martin noticed. "Careful there." Annie released the tray edge at once. "Yes, sir." Richard looked from Martin to Annie. "That's all." She left with Helen, keeping her pace even until they reached the service hall. Only then did she breathe fully. Helen took the tray from her. "What did you see?" Annie hesitated. Helen's voice lowered. "I did not ask what you were looking for. I asked what you saw." "A name." Annie said. Northlake. Helen's face gave away nothing, but her silence sharpened. I saw it in the library too, Annie added. On old files. Old companies have old vendors. I know. Then why does your face look like you just found a live wire? Annie looked toward the closed sitting room door. Martin's voice floated through, still smooth, still certain. Because old vendors don't usually show up 3 times in one day unless someone keeps feeding them, she said. Helen did not praise her. She did not warn her. She only folded the cloth in her hand and said, Finish the pantry shelves. And Miss Carter? Yes, ma'am. In this house, when something repeats, write it down somewhere safe. Annie returned to the pantry, but her thoughts stayed on the name. Northlake, in the library. Northlake, in Richard's call. Northlake, on the paper beside Martin Blake's hand. By the time the meeting ended, the rain had stopped tapping the windows, leaving the house too quiet. Martin left with his coat over one arm, and his smile still fixed. Richard remained in the sitting room long after the front door closed. Upstairs, later that night, Annie opened her laptop in the attic room. She did not access anything private. She did not copy company files. She only opened a blank sheet and typed one word in the first cell, Northlake. Then she saved the file, closed the laptop, and sat in the small, quiet room while the house settled around her. She had come here needing a roof. By the end of her first full day, the roof had begun to whisper. The next morning, Annie woke before the alarm on her phone could vibrate. The attic room was gray with early light, and for one quiet second she did not remember where she was. Then the slanted ceiling, the small desk, the narrow bed, and the sound of rainwater dripping from the roofline returned one by one. She sat up, touched the backpack beside the bed, and looked at the locked door. Still locked. That should not have felt like a gift, but it did. She washed quickly in the bathroom down the hall, careful to use the plain white towel and not the blue ones Helen had warned her about. By 6:10, she was downstairs in the kitchen, wearing the borrowed uniform with the heel grips pressed into the shoes. Helen was already there, slicing grapefruit with a small knife and reading a folded list. You're early again, Helen said. I didn't want to risk the stairs being slower than I thought. The stairs have been the same speed for 80 years. I haven't. Helen paused, then gave a small nod, as if the answer had passed some private test. Coffee first, then pantry shelves. Mrs. Whitmore has a charity luncheon at 11, which means she will say she doesn't want breakfast and then ask why no one brought toast. Annie reached for the coffee filter. Light toast or dark? Light, but not pale. Butter on the side, jam unopened. She likes choices more than she likes jam. Annie filed that away. Helen handed her a small notepad. Write house rules in this. Not company names. Not private conversations. House rules only. I don't need you memorizing 10 things and losing the 11th. Annie accepted it. Thank you. And before you ask, yes, you may keep it. I wasn't going to ask. You were thinking it. Annie said nothing because Helen was right. Marla arrived 20 minutes later with grocery bags and a weather report she delivered as if the city had personally offended her. Lakeshore Drive is a mess. Half the city forgot how to drive because water fell from the sky. Helen took the eggs from her. That is the official Chicago tradition. Marla noticed Annie writing in the notepad. Homework already? House rules, Annie said. Rule 1, don't make Helen repeat herself. Helen pointed a grapefruit knife in Marla's direction. Rule 2, don't make jokes before I've had coffee. Annie kept her face down, but a small smile escaped before she could stop it. The kitchen was busy, but not cruel. That made it harder to keep herself separate from it. After breakfast service, Helen sent Annie back to the library with a rolling cart and clear instructions. The left side boxes are old household records. The right side boxes are Mr. Whitmore's business overflow. You sort only what I place on the table. If you find loose papers on the floor, stack them face down and call me. If a folder has a red band, leave it closed. Yes, ma'am. Do not let curiosity do the work your hands were hired for. Annie nodded, though the warning landed close. She had spent half the night thinking about Northlake and telling herself not to touch what had not been given to her. A question could become a mistake if a person was not careful. The library felt different in the morning. Less mysterious, more cluttered. Dust showed on the lower shelves. The old rug near the desk had a corner turned under. A row of framed newspaper articles hung near the window. Whitmore Global opens Midwest Distribution Hub. Whitmore buys historic rail yard. Richard Whitmore named Business Leader of the Year. In each photograph, Richard looked younger, heavier in the shoulders, less tired around the mouth. Beside him in several pictures stood Martin Blake, smiling with one hand either on Richard's shoulder or near the edge of the document they were signing. Annie looked away from the photographs and began working. Helen opened 3 boxes and placed stacks on the table. Annual reports, event programs, old vendor summaries, invitations from chambers of commerce, thank you letters from hospitals and universities. Annie sorted by label and year. The work settled into a rhythm. Lift, check, stack, smooth the paper. Do not read more than necessary. Do not linger. Then she found Northlake again. This time the name was not on a folder. It appeared in a printed vendor summary from 9 years earlier. Halfway down a page marked Regional Support Services. The amount was small compared to the lines above it. A company that repaired loading equipment had a larger invoice. A fuel supplier had 5 times more. Northlake's amount looked harmless. That was what bothered her. She placed the page in the stack and continued. 10 minutes later, Northlake appeared again in a different year. Then again, the descriptions changed slightly. Administrative services, route coordination, vendor support, operations adjustment. The amounts rose, but not dramatically. A little, each year, enough to seem normal if someone expected costs to grow. Too neat if someone had learned to distrust neatness. Annie's fingers slowed. Helen, standing near the desk with a box cutter, looked over. You've gone quiet. I was quiet already. There is working quiet, and there is thinking quiet. You just changed. Annie kept her hand on the stack. May I ask a house question? You may ask. I may not answer. Does Mr. Whitmore keep old vendor records here because he reads them? Helen gave a dry sound that might have been a laugh. Mr. Whitmore keeps old vendor records because he believes no paper should leave his reach until it has exhausted its ability to accuse someone. That sounds like something he would say. It is something he said during an argument with his wife about storage space. Annie looked down at the page. Are these disposal papers? Some are. Some were moved here after office renovations. Why? Annie hesitated. If she said too much, she became a person poking into business. If she said nothing, the pattern stayed in the paper. I saw the same vendor name more than once, she said carefully. Northlake, different years, different descriptions. Helen's face did not change. Large companies use the same vendors for years. Yes, ma'am, but you do not think that is why you noticed it. No, Mo. Helen set the box cutter down. Explain without making an accusation. Annie took a breath. If a real vendor does the same job for years, the description usually becomes more specific, not less. People get comfortable. They write the actual service. Warehouse cleaning, freight scheduling, data migration, but these descriptions stay broad, like someone wants them to fit anything, and the increases are too smooth. Too smooth? Real costs jump, fuel changes, labor changes, contracts renew badly, people make mistakes. These lines climb like someone dragged them with a ruler. Helen looked at the page, then at Annie. You learned that from free courses? Some, and from not having enough money to let small charges go unexplained. The room held still for a moment. Helen reached for the page, read the vendor line, and returned it to the stack exactly where Annie had placed it. You will not take notes on this in your personal notebook. I won't. You will not put company information on your laptop. Annie's throat tightened. She had written the name only once the night before, and suddenly it felt like a stone in her pocket. I wrote the name down last night. Helen's eyes sharpened. Just the name, Annie said quickly. Nothing else. I didn't copy numbers. I didn't open private systems. I shouldn't have. I can delete it. Yes, Helen said. You can, and you will. Curiosity may make you useful, but carelessness will make you gone. Annie nodded. I understand. Helen studied her for another second, then lowered her voice. After you delete it, if the name appears again in papers I have given you to sort, you tell me. Not Marla, not the driver, not another staff member. Me. Yes, ma'am. And if Mr. Whitmore asks, you answer honestly. Annie looked toward the photographs of Richard and Martin. Will he ask? Helen picked up another folder. Men like Mr. Whitmore ask questions only after pretending they do not have them. By noon, the house grew louder. Mrs. Whitmore's luncheon preparation brought a florist delivery, 2 calls from a driver, and a brief argument over whether the cream coat or navy coat made her look too formal. Annie stayed in the rear hall, polishing a tray Helen had already said was clean enough. Richard came downstairs later than expected, wearing no tie, phone pressed to his ear. I don't care what Martin prefers. David gets the files he asks for. He stopped at the foot of the stairs when he saw Annie. Hold on. She froze with the tray in her hands. Richard covered the phone. Helen says you noticed something in the library. Annie glanced toward Helen, who stood near the pantry with no expression. Yes, sir. What? A vendor name repeating across old summaries. Northlake. She did not like that he already knew. Yes, sir. Richard ended the call without saying goodbye. What about it? Annie chose her words. I don't know enough to say something is wrong. That is not what I asked. The descriptions change, but not in a normal way. The amounts increase too evenly. It may be nothing, but it doesn't look like work being billed. It looks like a line designed to be accepted. Richard watched her. Accepted by whom? By someone too busy to ask why it keeps appearing. Helen's hand stilled on the pantry door. Richard did not move for several seconds. Then he turned toward the library hall. Show me. Annie looked down at her uniform, the tray, the borrowed shoes. Now? You saw enough to speak. Show me enough to justify it. Helen took the tray from Annie's hands. Go. Annie followed Richard into the library. The room seemed larger with him in it. He moved to the table where the sorted stacks waited, and she carefully pulled the vendor summaries from the pile without disturbing the rest. She placed them in year order. Here, she said, Northlake starts small. The wording is vague, but acceptable. Then it comes back here, here, and here. Different descriptions, same pattern. The increase is not large enough to upset anyone, but it is too consistent to be accidental. Richard lowered his eyes to the pages. You read all of these? No. I saw the repeating name while sorting. Then I checked only the line around it, because numbers are harder to fool if you check them long enough. Annie remembered saying that in the cafe. Hearing it from him made her feel exposed. Yes, sir. Richard took the pages, spread them wider, and placed one finger beside each Northlake entry. His face did not reveal much, but something behind his eyes shifted from irritation to calculation. This is old, he said. Yes. It may have been closed years ago. Yes. It may be perfectly legitimate. Yes. He looked up. You agree too easily. I'm not trying to win an argument. I'm trying not to overstate what I know. For a moment, he seemed almost annoyed by the discipline of that. Then his phone buzzed again. Martin's name crossed the screen. Richard looked at it, then at the papers. He did not answer. Annie noticed. He noticed her noticing. Do not mistake a coincidence for a conclusion, Miss Carter. I won't. And do not mention this name outside this room. I won't. Richard gathered the pages and slid them into a plain folder. Helen. She appeared at the door as if she had been waiting 2 steps away. Yes, sir? Find every box in this house with vendor summaries, retired operations, or administrative support labels. Miss Carter will sort them under your supervision. Nothing leaves this room. Nothing gets copied. Nothing goes to disposal until I say so. Helen nodded. Understood. Annie's pulse quickened, but she kept her voice steady. Sir, I'm not qualified to audit your company. No, Richard said. You are qualified to notice what my auditors may have stopped seeing. The sentence did not feel like praise. It felt heavier. Responsibility often did. Richard walked to the door, then turned back. And delete whatever you wrote on your laptop last night. Annie's stomach tightened. Helen looked at her, but did not speak. Richard's face remained calm. You told Helen. She told me nothing. I heard enough to guess. If you want to survive in my house, understand this. Honesty given early may save you. Honesty dragged out rarely does. Yes, sure, I'll delete it. Good. He left the room with the folder in his hand. Annie stood still until his footsteps faded. Helen crossed the library and began closing the open boxes. You did well, Helen said. It doesn't feel like it. It rarely does at the beginning. Annie looked at the stacks of old reports waiting on the table. Yesterday they had been dusty paper. Now they felt like doors, and every door might open into a room someone had tried to keep shut. What happens if I'm wrong? She asked. Helen lifted another box onto the table. Then we put the papers back and you learn to be careful. And if I'm not? Helen cut the tape with one clean motion. Then, Miss Carter, you may have walked into this house during the wrong storm. That night, in the attic room, Annie opened her laptop and deleted the file with Northlake's name. She emptied the recycle bin too, because half measures were how people got caught. Then she opened her personal budget spreadsheet and added one line beneath the others. Work changed today. She stared at the words, then added another. Be useful. Be careful. Do not confuse being needed with being safe. Downstairs, Richard sat in his study with the old folder open beside a fresh legal pad. Martin had called 3 more times. Richard had ignored all 3. The Northlake entries lay in front of him. Small, ordinary, and suddenly impossible to dismiss. For years, he had trusted reports because they arrived clean. Now a girl from his attic had shown him that clean could be the dirtiest thing on the page. By morning, the house had stopped sounding like weather and started sounding like work. The storm had passed sometime before dawn, leaving the windows gray and the garden soaked. But inside the Whitmore house, nothing moved slowly just because the sky had cleared. Helen had breakfast on schedule. Marla had laundry running before 7, and Annie stood at the staff table with a pencil, a legal pad, and 3 boxes of old vendor records waiting in the library, as if they had been placed there to test whether she understood the difference between being useful and being careless. Helen poured coffee into a travel mug and set it near the back door for the driver. Mr. Whitmore wants you in the library after breakfast. Annie looked up from the toast she had barely touched. With the files? With the files. Did he say what I'm supposed to do? He said you are to sort what I give you. Mark repeated vendor names on a separate sheet, and write nothing that includes dollar amounts unless I am standing beside you. Annie absorbed that rule. So names only? Names, years, and which box they came from. No copying full pages, no photographs, no phone, no laptop. I understand. Helen placed a small bowl of oatmeal in front of her. Then understand this too. If someone later asks how you found anything, the answer must be clean enough to survive being repeated in a room full of lawyers. Annie picked up the spoon. That sounds like something Mr. Whitmore said. No, that one is mine. By 8, Annie was in the library with Helen at the desk, and 2 fresh legal pads between them. Richard had not come down yet. The absence made the room feel less watched, not less serious. The boxes were marked in black marker. Retired operations, vendor support, regional administration, disposal review. Some labels were faded. Some had been written recently, over older tape. Annie noticed those first but did not comment. A new label over an old one could mean nothing. It could also mean someone had wanted the box to look less important. Helen cut open the first box and placed a stack on the table. Start here. Top sheet only unless I say otherwise. Vendor name, year, box label. If the same name appears again, add a check mark. If you see Northlake, tell me before writing. Annie nodded and began. The work required discipline because the temptation was constant. A page would slide forward showing a total. A memo would open enough to reveal a signature. A sticky note would cling to the back of a report with half a sentence written in ink. Annie forced her eyes to the lines Helen allowed. Vendor, year, source. She wrote carefully, leaving wide margins, making the list plain enough that no one could accuse her of building a secret file. Northlake appeared in the second stack. Ma'am, Annie said. Helen came to her side. Annie pointed to the page without touching the line. There. Helen read it. Write it. Annie wrote, Northlake Administrative Services, Year 9, Retired Operations Box. Helen let her continue. Within an hour, the list had grown. Northlake appeared again in vendor support. Then, a similar name surfaced. Northlake Admin Group. Then Northlake AS, abbreviated as if whoever typed it assumed no one would care. Annie marked each one, careful not to make the marks look dramatic. The pattern did not need drama. It only needed space to show itself. At 10, Richard entered the library with no greeting. He carried a folder under one arm and a cup of black coffee in the other. He looked at the legal pad, then at Annie. No laptop? No, sir. No phone? In my room. Helen? In her room means locked in the attic desk, Helen said. I checked. Annie felt heat rise in her face, but she did not object. Helen's strictness protected her as much as it restrained her. Richard set his folder on the desk. Show me the list. Annie turned the pad toward him. He read without touching it. Helen stood close enough to witness exactly what he saw. "These are all from old boxes?" Richard asked. "Yes, sir." "You open no sealed folders?" "No, sir." "You read no full reports?" "No, sir. Only vendor names, years, and box labels." Richard looked at Helen. She followed instructions, Helen said. He returned to the list. Northlake Admin Group. "I don't remember that name." "It may be an abbreviation," Annie said, "or a related vendor. I did not ask for a theory." "No, sir." He looked at her for a moment. "But you have one." Annie chose her answer carefully. "I have a question. That is usually a theory wearing church clothes." Helen made a small sound, almost a cough, but Annie kept her face steady. "Then I have a question wearing church clothes," she said. Richard's mouth shifted for half a second. "Ask it. If Northlake is a real vendor, why does its name change across records but stay close enough for a person to recognize it? That makes it harder to search by one exact name, but easy for someone who already knows what to approve." Richard did not respond at once. He moved to the window, looked out at the wet lawn, then took out his phone. "Helen, call David Langford. Tell him I want him here by noon." "Not a call." "Here." Helen nodded and left the room. Annie stayed beside the table, hands folded. Richard turned back to her. "You understand what you are touching?" "No, sir. At least that is honest. I understand it is bigger than old paper. I don't understand how big. It may be nothing." "Yes, sir. You keep saying that. Because it may be true. And if it is not?" Annie glanced at the boxes. "Then someone trusted the fact that big companies lose small things." Richard looked at her sharply. The sentence was too simple. That made it hard to dismiss. David Langford arrived at 12:15, carrying a leather briefcase and the expression of a man who disliked surprises but billed well for them. He was tall, silver-haired, and careful with his words. He greeted Helen by name, shook Richard's hand, then turned to Annie with professional courtesy that still held a question. "This is Miss Carter," Richard said. "Temporary household help." David looked from Annie to the legal pad. "And she is involved because she noticed what people paid to notice did not." "That is not an answer I enjoy as your attorney." "It is the answer we have." David removed his glasses and cleaned them with a cloth. "Miss Carter, do you work for Whitmore Global?" "No, sir." "Have you accessed any company system?" "No, sir." "Copied any documents?" "No, sir." "Taken photographs?" "No, sir." "Sent anything to anyone outside this house?" "No, sir." David looked at Helen. "You supervised?" "Yes." "Every minute?" Close enough to know what she saw and what she did not. David put his glasses back on and bent over the legal pad. His face gave little away, but his reading slowed as he moved down the list. Northlake Administrative Services, Northlake Admin Group, Northlake AS, Lakefront Administrative Support. He tapped one line. "This one interests me." Annie looked where he pointed but said nothing. David noticed. "You have thoughts, Miss Carter?" "I was told not to make theories. I'm a lawyer. I live on theories until facts become useful." Richard's eyes moved to her. "Answer him." Annie took a breath. "Lakefront may be nothing, but if someone wanted to move a pattern away from Northlake without changing the kind of service description, they might use a name close enough to feel familiar but different enough to pass a search." David studied her for a few seconds longer than politeness required. "How much formal training do you have?" "None that comes with a diploma." "That was not what I asked." "Free courses, public library, temp data work, mostly spreadsheets, cleanup, inventory lists, basic reporting." "And you learned pattern recognition from that?" Annie's voice stayed quiet. "When you don't have much money, a wrong number is not a mistake. It is dinner missing. You learn to see where things leak." The room went still. David looked at Richard. "I want these boxes secured. I want chain of custody from this point forward. Helen, no one handles them without you or me present." "Richard, do not call Martin about this." Richard's face hardened. "I know better." David did not soften the answer. "I'm not sure you do. You trust him." "Trusted? Those are not the same thing, and you have not moved from one to the other yet." Richard said nothing. Annie lowered her eyes to the table. This was not a conversation meant for her, but she was standing inside it because the papers had pulled her there. David closed the legal pad. "Miss Carter, you are done for now." Annie looked to Helen. Helen nodded. "Kitchen. Marla needs help with pantry inventory." Annie stepped away from the table. Before she reached the door, Richard spoke. "Miss Carter." She turned. "You did not look pleased when Mr. Langford agreed with you." "No, sir." "Why not?" "Because if I'm right, Someone did this on purpose. Richard's face did not change, but the words entered him. Go help Marla. Yes, sir. In the pantry, Marla handed Annie a clipboard and a pencil. Count canned tomatoes, chicken broth, pasta, and coffee. If Helen asks, we are low on cinnamon because Mrs. Whitmore keeps pretending she doesn't put it in oatmeal. Annie took the clipboard. Her hands still felt tight from the library. Marla glanced at her. You look like someone handed you a bill you didn't make. Annie reached for the first shelf. Something like that. You'll learn. Rich houses have quiet bills. They just call them other names. Annie counted the cans. 12 crushed tomatoes. 8 diced. 6 whole peeled. She wrote each number down. Grateful for inventory. That meant exactly what it said. Upstairs, the boxes were moved from the library to Richard's study, under Helen's watch. David made calls in a low voice. Richard stood near the desk, with the Northlake list in his hand. For the first time in days, Martin did not call. That should have made the house feel calmer. Instead, the silence felt planned. That evening, Annie returned to the attic room with tired feet and a mind that would not rest. She opened her personal budget spreadsheet, not the deleted file, not anything about Northlake, just her own record. Day 3, work, library sorting, pantry inventory, debt, roof, food, trust not yet earned. She paused, then added one more line. Some numbers hide because powerful people teach everyone to look away. Downstairs, Richard sat across from David Langford, while rainwater dripped from the gutters outside the study window. David placed a sealed evidence bag on the desk. Inside were the first copied pages from the old vendor records. We do this carefully, David said. No accusations until the documents can stand without emotion. Richard looked at the bag, then toward the ceiling, toward the attic he had not thought about in years. And the girl? David followed his gaze. For now, she is either a witness, a liability, or the only reason we are asking the right questions. Richard's eyes returned to the sealed papers. I know, he said, but he did not yet know which one frightened him most. The next 2 days passed with the strange quiet that comes before people admit a house has changed. Nothing obvious happened. Breakfast still arrived at the proper hour. Mrs. Whitmore still took tea upstairs and sent down short instructions through Helen. Marla still complained about the weather, the laundry machines, and the price of eggs. Richard still left before 8 in the morning and returned after dark with his phone in his hand and his coat open as if he had forgotten the season. But the library no longer felt like storage. It had become a room where everyone spoke more carefully. Helen kept the old boxes locked in the study when she was not supervising Annie. David Langford came twice, each time carrying a briefcase and leaving with sealed copies of certain pages. Richard said little in Annie's presence, but he watched the legal pad each time she added a repeated vendor name. He did not praise her. He did not apologize for doubting her. Annie preferred that. Praise could turn into a leash if a person accepted too much of it. On the 3rd morning after David's visit, Helen placed a fresh stack of papers on the library table and said, Today is not about Northlake. Annie looked up. What is it about? Whether Northlake has cousins. Annie understood. Similar names, similar services, similar wording, similar timing. You are not hunting for guilt. You are sorting patterns. Yes, ma'am. And if you feel excited, stop. Annie blinked. Excited? People who find something important sometimes start wanting the next thing to be important too. That is how they get sloppy. Annie nodded slowly. No wanting. Just looking. Good. The stack Helen gave her came from a box marked Regional Administration. Most pages were ordinary. Uniform suppliers. Snow removal contracts. Equipment maintenance. Security monitoring. Annie wrote nothing unless a name repeated or a description sounded too broad to mean real work. An hour passed, then another. Her shoulders began to ache from sitting straight, but she did not lean over the table. Helen had already corrected that once. If you bend into the paper, she had said, you will start reading what you were not asked to read. Near noon, Annie found the first related name, Lakefront Vendor Solutions. She did not speak immediately. She looked at the year, the box label, the description, administrative routing support. The wording had the same loose shape as the Northlake lines. She raised her hand slightly, almost like a student. Helen came over. What? Annie pointed. This one. Maybe nothing. Helen read. Why? Lakefront, North Lake. Same kind of name, same kind of description. Not enough to mean anything alone. Helen looked at her. Write it down. Annie did. 20 minutes later, she found Ashfield Vendor Support, then Midwest Routing Partners, then Lakefront again, under a different year. None of it proved anything. That was what made it hard. Wrongdoing in stories looked obvious. Wrongdoing in paperwork wore a clean shirt and stood in line. By early afternoon, Richard entered the library with David behind him. David carried a thin folder, his expression even less pleasant than usual. Helen straightened. "Sir," Richard looked at Annie's list. "Show Langford what you found." Annie turned the legal pad. "These may be unrelated." David looked down. "You are learning the first rule of legal work. Everything may be unrelated until the wrong person says it is not." He ran a finger down the list without touching the paper. Lakefront Vendor Solutions, Ashfield Vendor Support, Midwest Routing Partners. All broad service descriptions? Yes, sir. Same years as North Lake? Some overlap. Not all. Good. Overlap matters more than matching. Richard's attention sharpened. Why? David opened his folder and removed a printed page. Because if the same vendor name appears too long, auditors begin to recognize it. If related entities rotate through adjacent years, the money keeps moving while the pattern stays blurred. He looked at Annie. That is not a conclusion. That is a reason to ask for more. Annie kept her hands folded under the table. Yes, sir. Richard looked impatient. Do we know who approved them? Not yet, David said. And before you ask, no. I am not pulling Martin into this conversation until I know whether he is a witness, a source, or the reason we are here. The name settled over the room, Martin Blake. No one looked toward the photographs this time, though his face was still there in several frames. Richard's voice lowered. Choose your words carefully. I am, David replied. That is why I said them slowly. Helen's eyes moved between the two men. Annie focused on the paper in front of her. Richard turned toward the windows. Outside, the sky had cleared enough for pale light to fall across the lawn. Martin built this company with me. David closed the folder. Then he will understand why you need clean answers. That sounds like something a lawyer says when he already suspects the answers will not be clean. It is something a lawyer says when his client has mistaken trust for evidence. Richard turned back sharply. Annie thought he might answer with anger, but he did not. He looked older in that moment. Not weak. Just suddenly aware of the weight of 25 years. Helen broke the silence. Lunch is ready in the kitchen. Miss Carter has not eaten. Annie looked up. I'm fine. Helen did not turn. That was not a question. David gave a dry smile. I would obey her. I do. Richard picked up Annie's legal pad, then paused. May I? Annie did not know why he asked. The paper was his. The house was his. The boxes were his. Still, something in the question mattered. Yes, sir. He took it and handed it to David. Make a copy. Return the original to Helen. David nodded. Annie followed Helen to the kitchen. Marla had left a bowl of chicken noodle soup and half a grilled cheese sandwich on the staff table. The meal looked simple, but the smell made Annie realize she had been holding herself together on coffee and toast. Helen sat across from her with a cup of tea. Eat before you think. Annie picked up the spoon. Do you think I made things worse? I think things were already worse. You may have made them harder to ignore. That feels the same. It isn't. Annie ate a few spoonfuls in silence. Mr. Whitmore looked hurt. Helen's fingers rested around her cup. He is a proud man. Proud men can survive losing money. They have a harder time losing the story they told themselves. About Mr. Blake? About himself? About who he was smart enough to trust? Annie looked toward the rear hall. I shouldn't know this much. No, Helen said. But knowing less will not make you safer now. Being exact might. The kitchen door opened before Annie could answer. Mrs. Whitmore entered in a navy dress, a purse on her arm, and a controlled expression that made Marla suddenly busy at the sink. Helen, she said, I need the car in 15 minutes. Yes, ma'am. Mrs. Whitmore's gaze moved to Annie. You are still here. Annie set down the spoon. Yes, ma'am. And now lawyers are coming in and out of my house more than usual. Annie did not answer because there was no safe answer. Mrs. Whitmore stepped closer to the staff table. Did my husband ask you to look through company papers? No, ma'am. Helen gave me papers to sort. I noticed repeated vendor names. You noticed? Yes, ma'am. People in this house are paid very well to notice things. Annie lowered her eyes for a second, then raised them again. Maybe they noticed different things. Mrs. Whitmore's face tightened, but not with anger alone. Something else moved there. Concern, perhaps, or fear dressed as discipline. Helen spoke softly. She has followed every instruction given. I hope so, Mrs. Whitmore said. Because if this becomes a public embarrassment, no one will remember who started with good intentions. They will only remember who was in the room. Annie understood the warning. She was not being cruelly dismissed. She was being told how the world worked when wealthy people needed a name to absorb damage. I don't want to embarrass anyone, Annie said. That is rarely enough to stop embarrassment. Mrs. Whitmore turned to Helen. 15 minutes. When she left, the kitchen stayed quiet until Marla turned off the faucet. Well, Marla said carefully, that went better than it could have. Helen looked at her. Do not help. Annie finished the soup because Helen was watching. After lunch, she returned to the library, but Richard and David had moved the legal pad to the study. Helen gave her safer work, dusting shelves, replacing books, flattening empty boxes. It should have calmed her. Instead, the quiet made every thought louder. Near 4 o'clock, Richard called her into the study. David stood near the desk with several pages laid out. Richard stood behind the chair but had not sat down. Helen remained by the door, arms folded. Miss Carter, David said, I need you to explain how you grouped these names, slowly. Annie stepped closer but did not touch the pages. I grouped by repeated service language first. Administrative support, routing support, vendor support, operations adjustment. Then I looked at names that sounded like places instead of services. Northlake, Lakefront, Ashfield, Midwest. Then I checked whether they appeared near the same years. David nodded. You did not group by amount? No. Helen said not to write amounts. But did you notice them? Annie hesitated. Some. Richard spoke. Answer fully. They rose too evenly. Not exactly the same, but controlled. Like someone wanted increases that looked normal. David looked at Richard. That matches what I saw. Richard's face remained set. And what did you see? David tapped one page. A structure, not proof yet, but enough to secure the records and pull the corporate archive. Richard's jaw tightened. Do it. There is another issue. David took off his glasses. Access logs. If these vendors were approved through normal channels, the archive will show who touched the files. If the wrong name appears there, you need to be ready. Richard did not ask which wrong name. Everyone in the room knew. Annie wished, suddenly, that she were back in the pantry counting cans that meant only cans. But she had followed the numbers this far, and numbers did not become harmless just because people grew afraid of their destination. Richard turned to her. You will continue tomorrow. Yes, sir. You will do exactly what Helen and David tell you. Nothing more. Yes, sir. And if Martin Blake speaks to you, you tell Helen immediately. Annie's stomach tightened. Do you think he will? Richard's phone vibrated on the desk before he could answer. Martin Blake. The screen lit up between them like a name called in court. Richard let it ring once, twice, 3 times. Then he silenced it. David looked at him. That may be your answer. No one spoke after that. That night, Annie sat in the attic room with her laptop closed. She did not open her spreadsheet. She did not want to write the truth of the day because writing made things feel official. Instead, she listened to the house. Pipes, wind near the roofline, a distant door closing. Somewhere below, a man who owned more than she could imagine was learning that money did not protect him from betrayal. Somewhere else in the same house, a woman was wondering what kind of storm her husband had brought through the front door. Annie placed one hand on the laptop lid and told herself the same thing Helen had said. Be exact, because in a house full of power, exact might be the only safe thing left. The next morning, Richard did not leave for the office. That alone changed the house. Helen noticed first, because Helen noticed anything that disturbed routine before it became a problem. His coffee remained on the kitchen tray at 7:15 instead of being carried to the car. His driver waited under the portico with the engine off. Mrs. Whitmore came downstairs in a cream sweater, saw Richard crossing the hall toward the study instead of the front door, and stopped with one hand on the banister. You're not going in? She asked. Not yet. That sounds worse than yes. It may be. She looked toward the rear hall, where Annie stood with a folded stack of dish towels in her arms. Does this have anything to do with the young woman you brought home during a storm? Richard's answer came too slowly. It has to do with old records. Mrs. Whitmore gave him a measured look. Old records do not usually keep my husband home on a weekday. They do today. She did not argue in the hall. That was not her way. She turned and continued toward the dining room. Then I hope someone in this house still remembers breakfast. Helen, passing behind Annie with a tray, murmured, "That means toast, light, with honey nearby." "I remember," Annie said. "Good. Memory is cheaper than apology." By 8, the study had become a working room. David Langford arrived with 2 associates, both in dark coats, both carrying document cases. Helen led them in herself and closed the door behind them. Annie was sent to the library, not to examine vendor papers, but to clear the long table and prepare space for files that would be reviewed under supervision. The safer work did not fool her. Every movement in the house had tightened. Marla came in with a basket of laundry and lowered her voice. "You ever seen lawyers before breakfast?" "No. It means rich people are scared early." Helen entered before Annie could answer. "Marla, laundry, Miss Carter, library." "Yes, ma'am." Both women said at once. Annie worked without rushing. She removed old magazines, stacked them by year, wiped the table, set out pencils, notepads, and plain folders as Helen directed. She did not bring her laptop. She did not bring her phone. The absence felt strange, like leaving a hand upstairs. Near 10, David came into the library with Richard behind him. Helen followed, carrying a sealed box from the study. David placed it on the table. "Miss Carter, I am going to ask questions. You answer only what you know. If you are guessing, say you are guessing. If you do not know, say you do not know. Do not try to be helpful beyond the truth." Annie nodded. "Yes, sir." Richard stood near the window, arms at his sides, not sitting. "This is not an interrogation." David gave him a sideways look. "Everything is an interrogation if done correctly." Helen set the box down. "That must be why people avoid lawyers at dinner." David almost smiled. With reason, he opened the box and removed copied sheets, not originals. "These are from the corporate archive. We pulled vendor indexes from the years matching your notes. No full reports yet, just indexes. I want you to see whether any names connect to the ones you marked." Annie did not reach for the papers until David slid them toward her. She read slowly. North Lake Administrative Services appeared first, then Lakefront Vendor Solutions, then Ashfield Vendor Support, then something new, Clearpoint Operations Liaison. The wording made her pause. It sounded like a job title pretending to be a company. "This one," she said. David moved closer. "Why? Clearpoint. It doesn't match the place name pattern exactly. But the service description is the same kind of broad. Operations Liaison, Vendor Support, Administrative Routing. It says everything and nothing." Richard's eyes narrowed. "Everything and nothing? If I write coffee delivery, you know what happened. If I write hospitality support, I could mean coffee, cups, napkins, flowers, or nothing anyone can check quickly. These names do that. They make the expense sound normal without making it clear." David marked the copy. "Good. Keep going." Annie moved through the pages. Some names meant nothing to her. Some were ordinary. Snow removal had real seasonal spikes. Security system maintenance had invoice numbers tied to locations. Fuel surcharges rose unevenly because fuel did not respect neat patterns. But the administrative vendors behaved differently. They floated through the years in small, controlled amounts, always described in language broad enough to pass a tired eye. After 20 minutes, Annie pushed one sheet back. "This page is different." David looked down. "How?" "The amounts are not here, but the approval codes are." Richard stepped closer. "You can read approval codes?" "No, but I can read repetition. These 4 vendors have different names, but the approval code begins with the same 3 letters. David took the page. MBF. Helen looked at Richard. Richard's face did not move, but the room seemed to lose air. Annie noticed and wished she had not said the letters aloud. "Does that mean something?" David answered, not Richard. "It may be an internal routing code. Or?" David's voice stayed careful. "Or initials." Richard turned away from the table. "Martin Blake Finance." No one spoke for several seconds. Annie looked down at her hands. She had not accused him. She had only read what was printed. Still, the name now sat in the room like a person who had entered without opening the door. Richard reached for his phone, then stopped. David saw the movement. Do not call him. I wasn't. You were close enough. Richard's eyes cut to him. I said I wasn't, and I am saying as your attorney do not do anything that gives him warning. Helen's voice was calm. Coffee? Richard looked at her as if he had forgotten where he was. No. Then perhaps sit before you start making standing decisions. He did not sit, but the remark slowed him. Annie moved back from the table. I should go. Richard looked at her. Why? Because this is not staff work anymore. David answered before Richard could. She's right. Richard turned to him. You wanted her to review the indexes. I wanted her to identify patterns. She has. The moment a name linked to Martin appears, her role changes. She should not be exposed to strategy conversations. Annie did not fully understand the law, but she understood being moved out of a room before people discussed things that could harm her. For once, she was grateful. Helen touched her elbow lightly. Kitchen. Annie followed her out. In the hall, the air felt cooler. She kept her voice low. Did I do something wrong? No. Then why do I feel like I did? Because powerful men make entire buildings shake when they learn the floor under them is not solid. It is easy to mistake the shaking for your fault. Annie held that answer for a moment. Helen looked toward the closed study door. Now Mr. Whitmore learns whether he wants the truth or only wanted proof that he was right. In the kitchen, Marla had made coffee but forgotten to pour it. Well? Helen gave her a look. Well, what? I know that face. That is your somebody expensive lied face. Marla. What? I didn't say which expensive person. Annie sat at the staff table because her legs had begun to feel unreliable. Helen placed a cup of tea in front of her. Drink. I'm not sick. No, but you are thinking too fast. Marla leaned against the counter. Sweetheart, if Helen gives you tea before noon, take it. That means the day has teeth. Annie wrapped both hands around the cup. The warmth helped. Around noon, Mrs. Whitmore entered the kitchen again. This time, she did not ask for toast or tea. She looked directly at Helen. Is my husband still with David? Yes, ma'am. And Martin? Not here. Mrs. Whitmore's eyes moved to Annie. But he is part of whatever this is. Annie stayed quiet. Helen answered, that is for Mr. Whitmore and Mr. Langford to discuss. Mrs. Whitmore's mouth tightened. Of course. She turned to Annie. Did you find something? Annie chose the safest truth. I noticed repeated codes. Codes? Yes, ma'am. And now my husband's best friend may be involved. I don't know that, but you suspect it. Annie looked at Helen, then back at Mrs. Whitmore. I suspect the records are asking for someone braver than me to read them. The answer seemed to reach Mrs. Whitmore in a way Annie did not expect. The woman's face softened by a fraction, not kindly, but less guarded. Bravery is often overrated, Mrs. Whitmore said. Accuracy lasts longer. Helen said something like that. Helen usually says the thing people should have said before they made a mess. Mrs. Whitmore turned to leave, then stopped. Miss Carter. Yes, ma'am? If this house becomes uncomfortable for you, tell Helen before you decide to vanish. Annie did not know what to do with that. Yes, ma'am. After she left, Marla raised both eyebrows. That was practically a hug from Mrs. Whitmore. Helen said, go fold towels. By late afternoon, Richard called Annie back, but not into the study. He stood in the library with David, Helen, and a new folder on the table. David spoke first. We pulled the access logs for one archived vendor index. Not enough for action, enough for concern. Your observation about the MBF code was relevant. Annie nodded carefully. Okay. Richard looked at her. Martin called me twice after we pulled the logs. Maybe that's normal. Maybe. But he did not believe it. Annie could hear that. David closed the folder. From this point forward, Miss Carter, you do not touch these records, unless Helen and I are both present. You do not discuss names, codes, papers, or Mr. Blake with anyone. If someone asks you about your work, you say you are sorting household archives. Yes, sir, Richard added. If Martin approaches you, you do not answer questions. You find Helen. Annie's mouth went dry. Would he approach me? Richard did not answer quickly enough. David did. He may try to learn what you know without appearing to ask. Men like him rarely begin with threats. They begin with charm. Annie remembered Martin's smile in the hall, the quick way he measured her and made it feel like politeness. I understand. Richard looked at her more directly. Do you? Yes, sir. I've met charming people before. Something in the way she said it closed the subject. That evening, Martin came anyway. He did not enter with the ease he had shown before. He arrived just after dinner, unannounced, claiming he needed 10 minutes with Richard before the morning board call. Helen answered the door and did not step aside as quickly as she had before. Mr. Whitmore is not receiving visitors. Martin smiled. Helen, I've never been a visitor in this house. Tonight you are. Annie stood in the service hall holding a tray of clean glasses. Martin's eyes found her past Helen's shoulder. Miss Carter, isn't it? He said warmly. How are you settling in? Helen's voice cut in before Annie could answer. She has work. Martin's smile did not move. Of course. Everyone does. Richard appeared at the end of the hall. Martin, Richard, we need to talk. Call my office in the morning. This is not an office matter. Everything is an office matter when you bring that tone into my home. For the first time since Annie had met him, Martin's smile thinned. Then I'll see you tomorrow, he said. He left without raising his voice, which somehow made the house feel less safe than if he had shouted. Later, in the attic room, Annie opened her spreadsheet and typed only one line. Charm asks questions with a smile. Then she closed the laptop and locked the door. Downstairs, Richard stood in the dark library looking at the photographs on the wall, his younger self beside Martin Blake at ribbon cuttings, warehouse openings, charity dinners, handshakes frozen in frames. He did not take them down. Not yet. By morning, the photographs were still on the library wall, but the house no longer treated them as decoration. Annie noticed it when Helen sent her in to open the curtains. The frames showed Richard and Martin at different ages, standing beside loading docks, ribbon cuttings, charity checks, warehouse maps, and governors who smiled for cameras as if prosperity had no cost. Yesterday, those pictures had looked like history. Now they looked like witnesses. Helen entered with a tray of coffee and set it on the side table. Do not look at those too long. Annie pulled the curtain cord. I wasn't. You were counting them. Annie let the curtain fall into place. There are 9 with Mr. Blake. 10. One is in the hallway. Annie turned before she could stop herself. Helen's face was calm, but her eyes held the tired patience of someone who had known a house long enough to know what it avoided. Did you ever think something was wrong with him? With Mr. Blake? Helen adjusted a cup on the tray. No. Annie was surprised by the answer. Helen noticed. Be careful with people after suspicion enters a room. Suddenly everyone claims they knew. Most didn't. I didn't. He was polite, punctual, generous at Christmas, and never left a glass where it could stain wood. In my profession, that covers a surprising number of sins. But you paused when he talked about Northlake. I paused because Mr. Whitmore paused. That's all? That was enough. Before Annie could answer, Richard came in with David Langford. Richard had not shaved as closely as usual, and David carried the same briefcase but now with a second folder under his arm. They did not greet the photographs. Neither of them looked at Martin's face on the wall, which made the effort obvious. David placed the folder on the table. We received the first archive summary from corporate records. Not full access logs yet, but enough to confirm the MBF routing code was used on more than one vendor category. Richard's voice was flat. How many? 7 so far. Helen's hand tightened around the coffee pot, then relaxed. Annie stayed near the curtain, unsure whether she should leave. David saw her and pointed gently toward the table. Miss Carter, come here. I want you to see only the vendor names, not the amounts. Richard looked at him. Is that necessary? No. Useful. Annie moved closer but kept her hands behind her back. David turned the page so only the left column showed. Northlake Administrative Services. Lakefront Vendor Solutions. Ashfield Vendor Support. Midwest Routing Partners. Clearpoint Operations Liaison. Prairie Contract Management. Harbor Administrative Group. David covered the rest with a blank sheet. Do these read like one family to you? Annie read them twice. Yes. Why? They all sound like they were named to be forgotten. Richard's eyes moved to her. Annie continued, careful with every word. Not fake exactly. Just empty. A real company usually wants to be remembered for what it does. These names avoid meaning. Administrative, vendor, routing, operations, management. They could fit almost any invoice. David nodded. That is what I thought. Richard walked toward the window. Thought. Not proved. Correct, David said. Which is why I called my forensic accounting contact. Quietly. Richard turned. I told you not to widen this. I widened it to one person who owes me discretion and has no relationship with Whitmore Global. If your own finance department is compromised, using them would be foolish. Annie looked down. Finance department. Martin. 7 vendors. The room seemed to narrow around the words. Helen spoke before Richard could. What do you need from Miss Carter? David gave her a small nod, as if he appreciated the direct question. Her method written out, not her conclusions. Just how she noticed the pattern. If this moves forward, we need to show she did not go fishing through confidential records. She sorted documents under supervision, observed repeated naming and descriptions, and reported upward. Write it where? Annie asked. On paper. In this room. Helen will sit with you. No laptop. I can do that. Richard looked at her. You understand this may later be read by people who will try to make you sound careless. Annie nodded. Then I'll write like someone is waiting to misunderstand me. David's expression changed, approving but restrained. Good. That is better advice than some lawyers follow. Helen brought Annie to the smaller desk near the bookshelves and placed lined paper in front of her. Plain words. Dates, if you know them. No feelings. Annie picked up the pen. Feelings don't help? They help people. They rarely help documents. For the next hour, Annie wrote. She described the first time she saw Northlake in an old vendor summary while sorting under Helen's direction. She wrote that she did not copy documents, did not photograph pages, did not access systems, and did not remove company records. She explained that she noticed broad descriptions and repeated vendor patterns because the wording changed without becoming more specific. She crossed out one sentence that sounded too dramatic and rewrote it plainly. Helen watched without hovering. At noon, Marla brought sandwiches to the library instead of making Annie come to the kitchen. Helen says if you don't eat, she'll start making threats with soup. Helen did not look up. I do not threaten with soup. I deliver consequences. Marla set down the plate and lowered her voice. Is this about Mr. Blake? Helen's head lifted slowly. Marla stepped back. That was me leaving. After she went, Annie looked at Helen. Everyone is going to know something soon. Everyone already knows something. They just do not know which shape it has. By mid-afternoon, the shape sharpened. David returned from the study with Richard behind him, and this time Richard held the folder himself. The paper edges were slightly bent under his hand. Miss Carter, David said, read this line only. He placed a page before her and covered the top and bottom with 2 sheets of paper. The visible line showed a vendor name, a routing code, and a short description. Prairie Contract Management. MBF 17. Transitional Vendor Support. Annie read it. That description is wrong. Richard's voice cut in. Wrong how? It says transitional, but the code ends in 17. If that number means a sequence, it suggests there were at least 16 before it. A transition doesn't usually need that many repeated entries unless the transition never ends. David looked at Richard. That is what my contact said. Richard did not speak. Annie wished she had not answered so quickly. I'm guessing. Yes, David said, but it is an educated guess based on document structure, and it matches an outside review. Richard turned away from the table. Martin created the transitional vendor program. When? David asked. After the Midwest expansion. Were you involved? I approved the expansion. Martin handled the vendor cleanup. David waited. Richard looked at him. Say what you want to say. If Martin handled vendor cleanup and these vendors multiplied under a routing code tied to his office, then either he was negligent, or someone used his authority, or he built the structure. Helen's face stayed still. Annie looked at the pen in her hand and realized she had been gripping it too hard. Richard said, he built half the company. David answered quietly. Then he knew where to hide inside the other half. The sentence struck harder than if he had raised his voice. Richard walked to the wall of photographs. He stopped before one from an opening ceremony years earlier, where he and Martin stood with hard hats under one arm and scissors in their hands. Richard reached up as if to straighten the frame, then let his hand drop. At that moment, the front doorbell rang. Helen looked toward the hall. You are not expecting anyone. Richard turned. The bell rang again. Marla appeared at the library door, unsettled. It's Mr. Blake. Annie stood without thinking. David closed the folder at once. No documents visible. Helen moved faster than Annie had seen her move before, stacking papers and sliding the legal pad under a plain household catalog. Richard remained by the photographs. "Should I leave?" Annie asked. "Yes," David said. "No," Richard said at the same time. Everyone looked at him. Richard's jaw was set. "If she runs from every room he enters, he will notice." David's voice sharpened. "He has already noticed her. Then let him notice what we choose." Helen stepped toward Annie. "You say nothing unless Mr. Whitmore speaks to you. If Mr. Blake asks you anything, you look to me." Annie nodded, though her mouth had gone dry. Richard walked out to the main hall. Helen followed. David remained in the library, one hand on the closed folder. Annie stood near the shelves, holding a stack of harmless magazines because Helen placed them in her hands at the last second. Martin's voice reached the hall, warm but tighter than before. "Richard, forgive the intrusion. I was nearby and thought we should clear the air." "You were nearby?" Richard asked. "In this weather, everywhere is nearby if the matter is urgent. The weather is clear." A small pause. "So it is." Annie heard footsteps. Then Martin appeared at the library entrance beside Richard. His smile arrived before the rest of him, smooth and practiced. His eyes moved across the room, over David, Helen, the covered table, and finally Annie with the magazines in her hands. "Miss Carter," Martin said. "Still settling in?" Annie looked to Helen. Helen answered, "She is working." "Of course." Martin looked at David. "And now the lawyers are working in the library. That sounds serious." David picked up a magazine from the table and opened it at random. "I am advising Richard on old storage records. A man with his habits creates work for men with mine." Martin laughed softly. Richard never could throw anything away. "No," Richard said. "I'm learning that may be useful." Martin's smile held, but his eyes changed. "Useful how?" Richard looked at him for a long moment. Old paper remembers what men forget. The room went quiet enough that Annie could hear the clock near the hall. Martin slipped his hands into his coat pockets. "Then I hope the paper is kind." "No," Richard said. "I hope it is accurate." Martin looked at Annie again, and this time his smile did not quite cover the calculation beneath it. "Accuracy from old paper. That sounds like Miss Carter's kind of work." Annie kept the magazine still against her chest. Richard stepped slightly between them, not enough to be obvious, enough to change the line of sight. "Miss Carter's work is assigned by Helen. Your concern is misplaced." Martin lifted a hand lightly. "No concern. Only curiosity." Helen's voice was polite and firm. "Curiosity wears out its welcome faster than most guests, Mr. Blake." For the first time, Martin did not answer immediately. Richard walked toward the door. "We can speak in my study." David closed the magazine. "I'll join you." Martin's eyes flicked to him. "Is that necessary?" Richard did not look back. "Today it is." The men left the library. Helen waited until their footsteps moved down the hall before taking the magazines from Annie. "You did well. I didn't do anything." "That is what you did well." Annie let out the breath she had been holding. "He knows." Helen looked toward the hall. "He knows enough to be curious." "And curious people?" Helen picked up the hidden legal pad and held it close. "They wear out their welcome." That evening, the study door stayed closed for nearly 2 hours. No raised voices came through, only the low rhythm of men who had known each other long enough to hide anger under manners. Annie helped Marla with dishes, folded towels, and checked the pantry list twice because ordinary numbers steadied her. Near 9, Martin left. His coat was buttoned, his smile gone. Richard did not walk him to the door. Annie was carrying clean glasses through the rear hall when Martin paused near the service entrance. For 1 second, there was no Helen between them. "You're very observant, Miss Carter," he said. Annie held the tray level. "I try to do my job, sir. Be careful. In houses like this, doing more than your job can be mistaken for ambition." Helen's voice came from behind Annie. "And blocking a service hallway can be mistaken for poor manners." Martin turned, smile returning by a fraction. "Good night, Helen." "Good night, Mr. Blake." He left. Annie stood still until the door closed. Helen took the tray from her hands. "Now you may breathe." Upstairs, Annie did not open her laptop right away. She sat on the edge of the bed and listened to her own pulse settle. When she finally opened the spreadsheet, she added one line beneath the others. Some warnings arrived dressed as advice. Downstairs, Richard stood alone in his study. On his desk lay a photograph he had taken down after Martin left. 2 younger men in front of the first Whitmore warehouse, smiling like trust was a thing that could not rot. Richard turned the photograph face down. Not discarded, not yet, but no longer watching him. The next morning, the house woke to a headline none of them had written. It arrived first on Richard's phone. then on David Langford's, then on Mrs. Whitmore's tablet at the breakfast table. Marla saw it last, which did not stop her from being the first person to say it aloud in the kitchen. Whitmore Global faces questions over suspicious vendor payments, she read, holding her phone too close to her face. Sources say board members are concerned about Chairman Richard Whitmore's oversight of long-running administrative contracts. She lowered the phone slowly. Well, that is not the kind of morning news you put with toast. Helen took the phone from her hand, read the headline once, and returned it. Do not repeat that, where Mrs. Whitmore can hear you. She has a tablet. Then do not help the tablet. Annie stood by the sink with a dish towel in her hands, the water still running over a cup she had stopped washing. Suspicious vendor payments, long-running administrative contracts. The words came dressed like news, but she recognized their shape. North Lake, Lakefront, Ashfield, Midwest, Clearpoint. Names that had been sleeping in old boxes were now awake in public. Helen noticed the cup under the running water. Turn that off. Annie did. Breathe. I am. Not convincingly. Before Annie could answer, Richard entered the kitchen. He was dressed for the office but had not put on his coat. His phone was in his hand, and his face had gone past anger into something colder. Mrs. Whitmore followed a few steps behind him, tablet held flat against her side. Who leaked it? She asked. Richard did not look at anyone at first. That is what I intend to find out. David came through the rear entrance without waiting to be announced, his briefcase in one hand and his phone in the other. Do not call Martin. Do not call Evelyn. Do not call anyone on the board until I'm in the room. Richard turned. Good morning to you too. It stopped being good when I saw my client's internal concern on a financial news site. Mrs. Whitmore's voice was calm, but sharp. Internal concern. That sounds cleaner than public humiliation. David looked at her. Humiliation is not our biggest problem. It is mine. Richard's eyes moved to Annie. She had not moved from the sink. Miss Carter. Library. Helen. With her. David. Study. David looked at Annie for one extra second. No sorting today, Richard answered before she could ask. No. Today we find out what someone wants us to do next. Annie followed Helen out of the kitchen. Her legs felt steady, but the house around her did not. In the hallway, the framed photographs seemed to lean closer. She knew they did not. Houses did not change shape because of headlines. People did. In the library, Helen closed the door and motioned for Annie to sit. You are not working until we know what this is. I can still help. That is the sentence that gets useful people used up. Annie sat at the small desk. Do you think Mr. Blake leaked it? Helen took a moment before answering. I think whoever leaked it wanted Mr. Whitmore reacting instead of thinking. Then it worked. Not yet. Down the hall, the study door closed. Voices started low and stayed there. Richard, David, Mrs. Whitmore. No shouting. That made it worse. Shouting wasted energy. These people did not waste much. Annie looked toward the library table, where the boxes had been removed the night before. Only cleared space remained. The absence of the papers felt louder than the papers had. She thought of the headline again. Sources say board members are concerned. Sources. That word was useful because it could hide anyone. Helen sat across from her. Tell me what you are thinking, not feelings. Thinking. Annie folded her hands. The leak mentions suspicious vendor payments but not the names. That means whoever leaked it knows enough to point at the problem but not enough to expose the pattern. Or they know the pattern and are holding the details back. Why hold them back? To control what happens next. Annie looked at the closed door. If Mr. Whitmore panics, he might call Mr. Blake. If the board panics, they might let Mr. Blake step in as the responsible person. If the public sees Mr. Whitmore's name first, the story becomes about his oversight before it becomes about who built the system. Helen listened without interrupting. Annie's voice lowered. If I were trying to trap a man, I wouldn't accuse him all at once. I'd make everyone think he looked guilty, then offer myself as the calm solution. Helen did not praise her. She stood. Stay here. Where are you going? To tell Mr. Langford exactly what you just said. Annie stood too. No, wait. That's only a guess. Helen opened the door. Then I will call it a guess. Sit down. Annie sat because Helen had said it like a command. 5 minutes later, David entered the library alone. He carried no folder this time. Miss Carter. Annie rose. Sit. Helen says you had a useful guess. I don't know if it's useful. That is my decision. Say it again. She repeated it, slower this time. David listened with his head slightly lowered, eyes on the floor rather than her face. When she finished, he nodded once. That is consistent with the timing, he said. Richard came in behind him. Consistent is not proof. No one said proof, David replied, but it tells us what not to do. Mrs. Whitmore stood in the doorway, arms crossed. And what is that? David turned. Do not let Martin become the man who saves the company from the scandal he may have helped create. Richard's face hardened. Careful. David met his eyes. No. You hired me to be careful with the law, not with your feelings. The room went still. Annie looked down at the desk. Mrs. Whitmore spoke before Richard could. He is right. Richard turned toward her. She did not soften. You have been defending Martin in your head all week. I can see it every time his name comes up. That may be human, Richard, but it is no longer useful. Richard's voice dropped. You think I don't know what this means? I think you know exactly what it means. I also think you are grieving a friendship before you have admitted there has been a death. No one answered. Outside, a delivery truck rolled past the front of the house, tires hissing on wet pavement. David looked at Annie. From this point forward, you do not discuss the article. If anyone asks, you know nothing beyond household work. If a reporter calls this house and you pick up, you give the phone to Helen. If someone messages you, you show Helen. Do not defend Mr. Whitmore online. Do not explain. Do not correct. Silence is not guilt. Sometimes, it is legal hygiene. Annie nodded. Yes, sir. Richard looked at her. Has anyone contacted you? No, sir. Check your phone. It's upstairs. Helen, I'll get it, Helen said. Annie felt exposed as soon as Helen left. She had almost nothing on that phone except job emails, temp agency alerts, a few saved bus routes, and messages from numbers she rarely answered. Still, phones carried pieces of a life, and having powerful people waiting to examine it made her skin feel tight. Helen returned with the phone in one hand and Annie's laptop bag in the other. Desk drawer was locked. Both were inside. David looked to Annie. Open the phone yourself. We do not need your private messages unless there is contact about this matter. Annie entered the passcode. There were 3 job alerts. 1 missed call from an unknown number, and 1 text from a number she did not recognize. Saw your name online. Are you the girl at Whitmore's house? Her stomach dropped. Richard saw her face. What? She handed the phone to David. He read the message, and his expression changed only slightly. How would anyone know your name? Annie shook her head. I don't know. Helen's mouth tightened. The cafe owner had it? He heard her say it, Richard said. And he had my card. David handed the phone back. Do not answer. Screenshot it, then send it to me. After that, block the number. Annie did as instructed. Mrs. Whitmore stepped farther into the room, and for the first time, her anger seemed to move away from Annie and toward the world outside the house. She has been here less than a week. Richard looked at David. Can we keep her name out of this? For now, if we are lucky. But if someone knows she is connected to the house, luck is already thinning. Annie closed her phone with both hands. I can leave. Helen turned sharply. No. The word came faster than anyone expected. Annie looked at her. Helen's face stayed composed, but her voice was firm. Leaving makes you look like a secret. Staying makes you staff. David nodded. She's right. If you leave now, and the press finds it, the question becomes why Richard moved you out after the article. That helps no one. Richard looked at Annie. You stay unless you choose otherwise for your own safety. But if you stay, you follow instructions exactly. I have been. I know. The 2 words were plain, but they changed something. Richard had not said he trusted her. He was too careful for that. But he had acknowledged that she had done what she said she would do. The study phone rang. Everyone heard it from down the hall. Helen went to answer, but Richard raised a hand. Let it go. The phone rang 4 times and stopped. Seconds later, Richard's cell lit up. Martin Blake. David saw the name. Do not. Richard stared at the screen. It rang until it stopped. A voicemail appeared. Richard did not play it. Mrs. Whitmore crossed the room and took the phone from the table before Richard could change his mind. You can have this back when your lawyer tells you to. David looked almost impressed. Thank you. Richard gave her a long look. You are enjoying this too much. No, she said. I am enjoying it exactly enough. For the first time that morning, Marla's voice sounded from the hall. Helen? There's a news van slowing down outside the gate. The room shifted again. David picked up his briefcase. No one goes outside. Curtains stay as they are. Staff say no comment. Richard, we prepare a written response. Short. No details. No denial we may regret. Richard nodded once. Do it. Mrs. Whitmore looked toward Annie. And her? David answered. She goes back to routine. Not the library. Something ordinary. Helen took charge at once. Pantry inventory. Marla, still in the hall, made a faint sound. We just did pantry inventory. Helen looked at her. Then the pantry will enjoy being counted twice. Annie followed Marla to the kitchen, phone tucked away, hands still cold. Marla pulled open the pantry door and handed her a clipboard. Canned tomatoes again? Annie asked. Canned tomatoes are loyal, Marla said. They sit where you put them and don't leak to the press. Despite herself, Annie almost smiled. For the next hour, she counted ordinary things. 12 crushed tomatoes. 8 diced. 6 whole peeled. 10 boxes of pasta. 4 jars of peanut butter. 9 bags of coffee. The numbers were simple, honest. No hidden routing codes, no old friends, no public headlines. Just shelves and labels and food meant for a house that suddenly seemed less protected than it had the night she arrived. Near noon, Helen came in and stood by the pantry door. News van left. Annie nodded. Good. Another may come. I figured. Helen stepped inside and lowered her voice. Miss Carter, what you said about someone offering himself as the calm solution. Hold on to that thought. Do not chase it. Do not dress it up. Just hold it. Why? Because Mr. Blake has requested an emergency board call for tomorrow morning. Annie looked at her. To help? Helen's expression did not change. That is the word he used. Down the hall, Richard stood in his study, while David drafted a statement, and Mrs. Whitmore watched the gate through a narrow gap in the curtain. On the desk, the voicemail from Martin remained unplayed. Beside it lay the old photograph Richard had turned face down the night before. Richard reached for the photograph, then stopped. Not yet. Some things, once faced, could not be turned back over. At 7 the next morning, the emergency board call began behind the closed study door, and the rest of the house learned how loud silence could be. Richard was inside with David Langford. Mrs. Whitmore sat in the small dining room with tea she had not touched, and Helen kept the staff moving through ordinary work as if routine could hold the walls together. Annie was assigned to the pantry again, but there were only so many times a person could count coffee, pasta, and canned tomatoes before the numbers stopped calming her. Marla stood at the counter slicing oranges for a fruit bowl no one had asked for. If they wanted a calm call, they should not have called it emergency. Helen came in with a tray and gave her one look. Fruit can be cut without commentary. It can, Marla said, but it suffers. Annie wrote 10 bags of coffee on the clipboard, then crossed out the line and rewrote it more neatly. Her hand wanted to do something useful. Her mind kept returning to Helen's words from the day before. Martin had requested the board call to help. A man who wanted to help did not come to the house unannounced and warn a young woman about ambition in the service hallway. A man who wanted to help did not arrive with a smile that reached the room before the truth did. The study door opened at 8:20. David stepped out first, phone to his ear, his face controlled. Richard followed, and he looked as if he had spent the last hour listening to a verdict no court had yet delivered. Helen was already in the hall. Coffee? Richard shook his head. That means yes, Mrs. Whitmore said from the dining room doorway. She crossed toward him, still holding the untouched tea. What happened? Richard looked toward Annie in the kitchen entrance, then to Helen, then back at his wife. Martin recommended that I temporarily step away from daily financial oversight until the review is complete. Mrs. Whitmore's mouth tightened. How noble of him. David ended his call. He used words like stability, investor confidence, and continuity. Evelyn Price seemed receptive. 2 other board members asked whether Martin could act as interim financial authority. Helen's face did not change, but Marla muttered from the kitchen, "There it is." Helen turned her head. "Marla, I'm cutting oranges." Richard walked into the kitchen instead of the study. Everyone adjusted to him being there. Even the coffee maker seemed louder. Annie lowered the clipboard to her side. Richard looked at her. Yesterday you said the leak might be meant to make Martin look like the calm solution. Annie did not enjoy being right in a room full of people who had more to lose than she did. It was a guess. It is becoming a useful one, David said. Mrs. Whitmore placed her tea on the counter. What do we do now? David opened his folder. We stop reacting to Martin's timeline. We need the archived access logs before tomorrow's follow-up call. If they show his office routing these vendors, Richard can push for an independent review before any authority shifts. Richard's eyes narrowed. If. Yes, if. David looked at him. The law still likes if better than outrage. Helen stepped in. Where are these access logs? Corporate archive, David said. Some digital, some printed summaries from older systems. The problem is that the archive team reports through finance operations. Martin sighed. Mrs. Whitmore said. David nodded. Which means any direct request may alert the wrong people. Richard's phone lit up on the counter. Martin again. Richard let it ring. Annie looked at the phone, then at David. Are there older printed copies here? Every face turned toward her. She held the clipboard tighter. I'm not saying there are. I'm asking because Mr. Whitmore kept old vendor boxes in the library. If he kept vendor summaries, maybe he kept system transition reports too. When companies change systems, someone prints things because they don't trust the new one yet. David's eyes sharpened. Why do you know that? I did temp work for a clinic that changed scheduling software. The office manager printed everything for 2 months because she said computers were only honest until they weren't. Helen nodded once. Practical woman. Richard looked toward the library. We migrated finance systems after the Midwest expansion. David turned to him. Did you keep transition binders? I don't remember. Mrs. Whitmore gave a humorless laugh. That means yes. You kept tax manuals from 1998 because you said paper had manners. Richard ignored that, but not completely. Helen? Basement storage, Helen said. South wall. There are binders from the office renovation. I told you to throw them away. And I refused. You refused with great confidence. David closed his folder. Then we go to the basement. Helen held up a hand. Not we. The basement is narrow, dusty, and organized by a system only. I understand because I created it after losing patience with everyone else's. Miss Carter and I will bring up the boxes. Mr. Langford can inspect them in the library. Richard started to object, then stopped. Fine, but no one goes alone. Annie followed Helen down the rear stairs to the basement. The air changed as soon as they descended, cooler and dry, smelling of cardboard, old paint, and cedar blocks. Shelves lined the walls. Holiday decorations sat in labeled tubs. Wine crates stood near the far corner. Along the south wall were bankers' boxes marked in Helen's handwriting. Office renovation, finance migration, old systems, shred pending, do not touch. Without RW, Helen pointed. That one first. Annie pulled the box carefully from the shelf. Dust lift, Maos mating Moset diak, and she turned her face away until it settled. You were right to ask, Helen said. I don't know that yet. No, but you asked the kind of question people in larger rooms forgot. They carried 2 boxes upstairs. David met them in the library with gloves, a notepad, and an expression that suggested he had been waiting for this exact kind of inconvenience his whole career. Richard stood back while David opened the first box. Inside were binders, printed logs, email migration notes, and old access code lists from a finance system retired years earlier. David looked at Annie. You do not touch these unless I hand you a page. Yes, sir. For nearly an hour, David and Helen worked through the binders while Richard paced near the window and Mrs. Whitmore sat near the door, her hands folded. Annie stayed by the side table, carrying only what she was given, a blank folder, a pencil, coffee no one drank. Then David stopped. Richard turned. David laid one printed log on the table and placed a blank sheet over most of it, leaving one section visible. Vendor creation records. Year of the Midwest expansion. North Lake Administrative Services was added before the transitional vendor program was formally approved. Richard came closer. By whom? David did not answer immediately. He moved the blank sheet lower. Created by M.B. Finance Admin. Modified by M. Blake Delegate Access. The room held its breath. Richard read it once, then again. Delegate access could mean his assistant. It could, David said, except the timestamp is 11:46 p.m. on a Sunday, and the location code points to executive remote access. Mrs. Whitmore's voice was quiet. Martin's lake house. Richard looked at her. She did not look away. You complained that he worked there every weekend during that expansion. David turned the page. There is more. The approval structure was altered 2 days later. Richard's executive approval was added as automatic clearance for vendors under this transitional category. Richard's voice went low. I never approved automatic clearance. David met his eyes. Then we need to prove that. Annie heard her own pulse in her ears. This was no longer a pattern in old paper. It was a hand reaching through a system, using Richard's authority like a spare key. Richard stepped back from the table. For a moment, no one spoke to him. Not David, not Helen, not his wife. The old photographs on the wall seemed suddenly cruel. All those handshakes and ceremonies, all that public trust. Annie looked at the visible line on the paper. May I ask something? David glanced at Richard first. Richard gave one short nod. Why would someone add automatic clearance instead of approving every vendor manually? David answered. To reduce friction. Annie shook her head slightly. Or to make every later approval look like it came from the same top-level authority. If the category itself carries Mr. Whitmore's clearance, then each vendor under it inherits his shadow without needing him to touch every page. David went still. Richard looked at her. His shadow? I don't know the right legal word. David picked up his pen. No, but I understand the wrongness perfectly. Mrs. Whitmore looked toward Richard, and her anger had changed. It was no longer aimed at the embarrassment, or at Annie, or even at the headline. It had found a cleaner target. Martin did not just steal from you, she said. He used your name to make the theft look like your habit. Richard's face remained controlled, but his eyes had hardened in a way Annie had not seen before. David placed the log into a clear sleeve. This changes the board call tomorrow. We request independent forensic review, freeze vendor authority, and block Martin from interim control pending examination of legacy access. Richard nodded. Do it. His phone rang again. Martin. This time, Richard picked it up but did not answer. He watched the name until the ringing stopped, then placed the phone face down on the table. David exhaled slowly. That was difficult? Richard looked at the old log in the sleeve. No, that was late. Helen turned to Annie. Kitchen. Annie obeyed, grateful to leave the room before the weight of what they had found settled fully on her shoulders. In the kitchen, Marla was waiting with 2 mugs of tea. Basement ghosts? Marla asked. Worse, Annie said, sitting down. Lawyer ghosts? Paper ghosts. Marla pushed a mug toward her. Those are the worst kind. They keep receipts. Annie almost smiled, then wrapped both hands around the mug. She had come into this house with a repayment line and a spreadsheet and a promise to work. Now the house was asking her to keep seeing things people wished would stay blurred. That night, she opened her laptop and typed one new entry. A system can be turned into a trap if the wrong person knows where trust is stored. Downstairs, Richard sat in the library after everyone had gone. The old log lay sealed in David's evidence sleeve. The photograph of him and Martin remained face down on the desk. For the first time, Richard did not think of turning it back over. By 8 the next morning, Richard's study looked less like a room in a private home and more like a command center built by people who still cared about coasters. David Langford had placed sealed copies of the old access logs in a neat line across the desk. Mrs. Whitmore sat near the window with a yellow legal pad in her lap. Not because anyone had asked her to take notes, but because waiting with empty hands did not suit her. Helen stood by the door with a coffee tray no one had touched. Annie was in the kitchen, officially counting pantry stock again. But every person in the house knew the numbers that mattered were not canned tomatoes or bags of coffee. At 8:15, David checked his watch. The call opens in 5. Richard adjusted his cufflinks. Who's on? Evelyn Price, Samuel Reed, Thomas Grant, Olivia Chen, Martin, outside counsel for the board, and a representative from Investor Relations. Investor Relations? Mrs. Whitmore asked. David's mouth tightened. That means they are already thinking about optics. Richard looked at the sealed access log. Martin asked for the call. He will try to control it. Yes, David said. And you will not interrupt him too early. Richard's eyes lifted. I know how to handle a board. You know how to dominate a board. That is not the same thing this morning. Mrs. Whitmore wrote something on her pad. Listen to your lawyer, Richard. I am surrounded. You are advised, she said. There is a difference. Helen set the coffee tray on the side table and fed, if anyone in this room remembers how cups work. No one reached for one. At 8:20, David opened the laptop on Richard's desk and joined the call. Faces appeared one by one in small squares. Evelyn Price looked prepared, her white hair neat, glasses low on her nose. Samuel Reed appeared from an office with a city view. Olivia Chen joined from what looked like an airport lounge. Thomas Grant's camera angled too low, showing more ceiling than face. Then Martin Blake appeared, seated in his office at Whitmore Global, wearing a charcoal suit and the grave expression of a man ready to save something he had helped set on fire. Richard, Martin said, I appreciate you joining. Richard's face did not move. It is my company. A brief silence crossed the screen. Evelyn cleared her throat. Let's keep this orderly. Martin requested the call to address investor confidence and the vendor payment article. David, are you present as Richard's counsel? I am, David said. And Mrs. Whitmore? Thomas asked, sounding annoyed. She is in my home, Richard said. That is sufficient. Mrs. Whitmore did not look up from her pad. Martin lifted both hands slightly. No one is questioning family presence. We all understand this is difficult. I want to begin by saying what I should have said sooner. Richard built Whitmore Global with discipline and vision. None of us would be here without him. David's pen stopped moving. Richard remained silent. Martin continued. But the market does not respond to personal loyalty. It responds to stability. Right now, questions about historic vendor structures are becoming public. Whether those questions are fair or not, they are attached to Richard's oversight. I propose a temporary measure. Richard remains chairman, but day-to-day financial authority moves to my office until an internal review is complete. There it is, Mrs. Whitmore said quietly, not quite under her breath. Evelyn looked troubled. Martin, are you suggesting a formal transfer? Temporary, Martin said. Protective. No one is removing Richard. We are protecting him from unnecessary exposure while protecting the company from speculation. Samuel Reed nodded slowly. Investors may respond well to that. David looked at Richard, warning him without a word. Richard waited. Martin leaned slightly toward his camera. I've spent 25 years building this company with Richard. I know the systems. I know the old vendor structures. If there are explanations, I can find them faster than anyone else. That is exactly what concerns us, David said. The call went still. Martin's smile was faint. David, I expected caution from you, but not theatrics. No theatrics. We have archived records showing legacy vendor creation and routing activity tied to your finance authority before some of these vendor structures were formally approved. Evelyn sat straighter. What records? David lifted one sealed copy but did not hold it close to the camera. Retired finance migration logs. Printed during the Midwest expansion system change. They show North Lake Administrative Services created under MB Finance Admin, then modified through M. Blake Delegate Access. Additional vendor categories appear under related routing codes. Martin did not blink. That was what Annie would have noticed if she had been in the room. A surprised man needed time. Martin only changed his pace. Old system codes are notoriously messy, he said. MB could mean multiple things. Management batch, migration bridge, Midwest billing. David nodded as if he had expected the answer. It could. That is why we are requesting an independent forensic review and an immediate freeze on legacy vendor authority, including yours, pending review. Thomas Grant frowned. That seems aggressive. No, Mrs. Whitmore said, finally looking at the screen. What seems aggressive is asking for control of the exact area now under suspicion. Martin's eyes moved toward her square on the call. Eleanor, I know this is personal. It became personal when someone used my husband's name as cover. Richard looked at her then, but she kept her eyes on Martin. Evelyn raised a hand. One at a time. David, do these records prove misconduct? Not alone, David said. They prove enough to make Martin's proposed temporary authority inappropriate. Martin's expression tightened by 1 degree. So this is the new strategy? Cast suspicion on the one person who understands the system? Richard spoke for the first time since Martin's proposal. You said Northlake was a legacy cost. It was. You said it came from an old routing expansion. It did. You did not say your office created the structure before formal approval. Martin gave a small, disappointed shake of his head. Richard, after 25 years, I had hoped you would call me before letting your lawyer turn a clerical archive into a personal attack. David answered. He almost did. Fortunately, he stopped. Martin looked at him with quiet dislike. Olivia Chen, who had been silent until then, leaned toward her camera. Where did these records come from? David paused. From Mr. Whitmore's private storage archives. Who found them? Richard's face hardened. My household staff located boxes from the old office renovation. David reviewed them. That is not quite an answer, Olivia said. Before Richard could respond, Martin spoke with gentle concern. Is this related to the young woman reporters are asking about? Mrs. Whitmore's pen stopped. David's voice sharpened. Careful, Martin. I am being careful. A temporary staff member appears in Richard's home. Internal records are suddenly reviewed, and now the board is being asked to freeze my authority based on old papers no one has authenticated in full. We have to ask whether Richard is being influenced by someone who does not understand the company. Richard's hand closed around the edge of the desk. David cut in. The records are authenticated enough to justify review, and Miss Carter is not on this call. But she is in the house, Martin said. Richard's voice dropped. Do not use her as smoke. No one spoke. Evelyn looked from one square to another. I am moving that no temporary transfer of financial authority occur until independent counsel reviews the archived logs. I also support a freeze on legacy vendor creation and modification authority for all senior finance officers, including Martin and Richard, until the review is complete. Samuel hesitated. That may alarm investors. Mrs. Whitmore answered before David could, less than handing the keys to the man standing next to the smoke. Martin's smile vanished for a moment. Only a moment. Then it returned in a smaller, colder form. I see the mood of the room, David said. The mood is not evidence. No, Martin replied, but it does become record. Evelyn called for a vote. It was not unanimous, but it passed. Independent forensic review. Freeze on legacy vendor authority. No interim control for Martin. A public statement would say the board had initiated a review of historic vendor systems and that no change in chairman authority had been approved. When the call ended, Richard sat still. His face had held through the meeting, but the room changed once the screen went dark. Mrs. Whitmore set down her legal pad. He came for the company this morning. David closed the laptop. Yes. Richard looked at the sealed logs and used Annie to make it look like I had lost judgment. Helen's voice came from the door. That was the part I liked least. Richard turned. Where is she? Kitchen. Counting coffee for the third time in 2 days. Bring her. Helen left and returned with Annie a minute later. Annie entered with the clipboard still in her hand, as if carrying pantry numbers gave her a reason to stand there. Richard did not soften his voice. Martin mentioned you on the board call. Annie's fingers tightened around the clipboard. What did he say? He tried to suggest you were influencing me. I'm not. I know. The words landed plainly, without ceremony. Annie looked down because looking at him felt too exposed. David stepped in. It means you may become part of the story if Martin keeps pushing. We will try to prevent that. You need to stay with routine and answer no questions from anyone outside this house. Yes, sir. Richard looked at the clipboard. What were you counting? Coffee. How much do we have? 9 bags in the pantry, 1 open in the kitchen, 2 in the service cabinet. Marla says that is enough unless lawyers keep coming. David almost smiled. Helen did not bother hiding hers. Richard looked at Annie for another moment. You asked for one night to think clearly. Yes, sir. You may have given me one. Annie did not know how to answer that, so she chose the safest truth. Then I still owe rent. Mrs. Whitmore let out a short sound, not quite a laugh, not quite relief. Richard's expression shifted, small but real. Go help Helen, he said. Annie nodded and left the study. In the hallway, she pressed the clipboard against her chest and let herself stop for 1 second. Not to celebrate. Nothing was over, but a door that Martin had tried to close had not closed. In the study, Richard picked up the face-down photograph of himself and Martin. He held it for a long moment, then opened the bottom drawer of his desk and placed it inside. Not destroyed, filed away. That was enough for that morning. The next day did not begin with a headline. That made everyone more nervous. Bad news that arrived publicly at least gave people something to point at. Quiet meant someone was working where they could not be seen. Richard understood that. David understood it better. Helen acted as if the best defense against hidden movement was clean counters, locked cabinets, and staff who knew when to keep their mouths shut. Annie returned to ordinary work after breakfast, though nothing about the house felt ordinary now. She changed linens in the guest room no one was using, polished the side table outside the library, and helped Marla carry a basket of towels from the laundry room. The tasks kept her hands busy, but her mind stayed on the board call. Martin had tried to reach into Richard's house through her name. He had not needed proof. He had only needed suggestion. Annie knew that kind of tactic. A whisper could do damage if it landed in a room already looking for someone to blame. By mid-morning, David arrived with a woman Annie had never seen before. She was in her late 50s, short-haired, wearing a dark coat and plain shoes that made almost no sound on the floor. Helen met them at the rear entrance, not the front, and that told Annie the visit was meant to stay quiet. "This is Patricia Voss," David said in the kitchen, forensic accountant. "She does not work for Whitmore Global, does not report to the board, and does not enjoy small talk before coffee." Patricia looked at him. "I enjoy useful small talk." Helen handed her a mug. "Then you will enjoy this house. We have very little of the other kind today." Patricia took the coffee, thanked her, and turned to Annie. "You are Miss Carter." "Yes, ma'am." "You noticed the vendor pattern." "I noticed some repeated names and wording." Mr. Langford reviewed the rest. Patricia gave a small approving nod. "Good answer. People who overclaim make my job harder." Annie did not know whether to thank her, so she stayed quiet. David motioned toward the hall. "Library first, then the study." Richard was waiting in the library with Mrs. Whitmore near the window and the sealed copies laid out on the table. The original papers had been locked away again. No one sat until Patricia did. She opened her notebook, wrote the date, and said, "I will say this once. If you want comfort, call your pastor. If you want the truth, stop interrupting me when I find it." Mrs. Whitmore looked at Richard. "I like her." Richard did not answer. For the next 2 hours, Patricia reviewed the copied logs, vendor indexes, routing codes, and printed system transition reports. Annie remained in the room only because Patricia requested it. "I want her available," Patricia said. She saw the pattern before everyone else started defending their pride. Richard's mouth tightened, but he allowed it. Annie stood near Helen, hands folded. Patricia asked questions without looking up much. "When you first saw North Lake, what made you remember it?" "It repeated across different papers. Names repeat in large companies." "Yes, ma'am." "What made this different?" "The description stayed broad, but the label changed just enough to make exact searching harder." Patricia wrote that down. "And the increases?" "I only saw some amounts before Mr. Whitmore told me not to copy them." "I did not ask what you copied. I asked what you observed." Annie glanced at David. He nodded. "They rose too smoothly," Annie said. "Not identical, but controlled." Patricia's pen stopped. "Controlled is a good word." Richard finally spoke. "What does controlled mean in your field?" "It means I stop assuming accident." Patricia turned a page. "Normal business costs have texture. They jump, lag, correct, get argued down, get renegotiated, get mislabeled by tired clerks. These lines behave as if someone wanted them to seem alive without letting them wander." Mrs. Whitmore looked toward Annie, and this time there was no suspicion in her eyes, only the uncomfortable recognition that the girl from the attic had said nearly the same thing without the professional language. Patricia continued through the records. She circled MB Finance Admin, M. Blake Delegate Access, and the Automatic Clearance category. Then she reached the printed log from the basement binder and stopped longer than before. "This is the first real hinge," she said. David moved closer. "Why?" "The vendor program was created before the approval framework was finalized. That means someone built the channel first, then attached authority to it after the fact." Richard's face hardened. "In plain English." Patricia looked at him. "In plain English, someone dug the trench before telling you there was a road." The room went quiet. Annie felt the sentence settle into the walls. A trench. Not a mistake. Not a clerical error. A place prepared for money to move. David asked, "Can you tie it directly to Martin?" "Not directly enough for court from these copies alone, but enough to justify preserving every archive, freezing every related vendor, and questioning anyone with delegate access under his office." Patricia closed one folder. "You also need to assume he knows you are close." He came here, Helen said. Patricia looked at her. Then he knows. Richard looked toward the door as if Martin might appear again by force of habit. What will he do? Patricia leaned back in the chair, her voice steady. If he is innocent, he will cooperate and complain. If he is guilty and disciplined, he will try to move the center of the story away from documents and toward personalities. David said. He already started with Annie. Patricia turned to Annie. Has anyone contacted you? One text from an unknown number. Mr. Langford has it. Any email? I haven't checked since yesterday morning. I was told not to answer anything strange. Check now. With us present. Helen retrieved Annie's phone and laptop from the attic desk. Annie opened her email at the library table, aware of every adult in the room giving her privacy by looking just slightly away. There were job rejections, 2 automated confirmations, 1 temp agency notice, and a new message with no subject line from an address she did not recognize. Her hand stopped. David moved closer. Do not open it yet. Annie looked at him. It only shows the first line. What does it say? She read it softly. A smart girl knows when a rich man is using her. Mrs. Whitmore's face changed. Richard stepped toward the table. Open it. David raised a hand. Carefully. Patricia? Patricia took out her own phone. Forward it to David without replying. Then, we inspect the header later. Annie forwarded it. Only then did David allow her to open the email. It was short. A smart girl knows when a rich man is using her. Whitmore will blame you when this turns ugly. Tell the truth first. And people may still believe you. There was no signature. Annie read it twice. And each time, the words tried to find an old bruise. Tell the truth first. People may still believe you. It was written by someone who understood how easily a poor black woman in a rich man's house could be turned from witness into scandal. Richard read it over David's shoulder. His voice went cold. Martin, David said, we don't know that. I know it. No, Patricia said. You feel it. We prove it. Richard turned on her, but she did not move. Mrs. Whitmore came to the table and stood beside Annie, not touching her, not comforting her in a way that would make the room sentimental. Just standing there, making it clear Annie was not alone at the table. Miss Carter, she said, listen carefully. You are not responsible for the ugliness of people who use fear as a tool. Annie nodded, but her throat had tightened. Helen's voice came next, firmer. And you are not leaving because someone learned how to send an email. Annie looked at her. I wasn't going to. Good. I dislike repeating myself. Patricia pointed to the printed logs. This email means he, or someone helping him, wants her unstable. That makes her observations more valuable, not less. But from now on, she must not be the only person who can explain the pattern. We document the method, duplicate the findings, and remove emotion from the chain. David nodded. Agreed. Richard still looked at the email. He threatened someone under my roof. Mrs. Whitmore's answer was quiet. Then protect her the right way. Not with anger. With proof. The words held him in place. By late afternoon, Patricia had Annie explain her grouping method again. This time while David wrote it in formal language. Vendor families. Broad service descriptions. Smooth increases. Routing code overlap. Timeline before approval. Automatic clearance. Annie did not touch original papers. She did not make accusations. She answered only what was asked. When she did not know, she said so. At 6, Patricia closed her notebook. You have enough for tomorrow's board packet. Not enough to finish the war. Enough to stop Martin from holding the keys. Richard looked at David. Send it tonight. David nodded. To independent counsel, and Evelyn only. No wider circle. Helen gathered the empty coffee cups. Dinner will be simple. People who are preparing for battle do not need complicated sauces. Marla, passing in the hall, murmured, Finally, a policy I understand. No one laughed much, but the kitchen felt less brittle for a moment. That night, Annie sat in the attic room with the threatening email printed and sealed downstairs, no longer trapped inside her phone. She opened her personal spreadsheet and stared at the line from the day she arrived. Debt to repay. For the first time, she did not add a number beside it. Instead, she typed slowly, Truth is not a favor, it is work. Downstairs, Richard stood in the library with Mrs. Whitmore beside him. The photograph of Martin remained in the drawer. The old access log lay sealed on the desk. The board packet waited in David's hands. Richard looked at his wife. "I thought bringing her here was a risk." Mrs. Whitmore looked toward the ceiling, toward the attic room. "It was." He turned to her. She met his eyes. "Just not the kind you thought." By the time the board packet reached Evelyn Price, the house had already prepared for another kind of weather. No rain pressed against the windows that morning. No storm shook the roof. Sunlight came through the kitchen glass in clean lines, falling across the staff table, the coffee mugs, and Annie's hands as she sorted napkins Helen had already told her were folded well enough. The calm outside felt dishonest. Richard had gone to the office before dawn with David Langford and Patricia Voss. Mrs. Whitmore remained at the house, not because she had no place to be, but because leaving the house during a crisis felt too much like giving it up. Helen kept everyone on routine. Breakfast, laundry, pantry, guest towels, silver drawer, back hall. The ordinary work moved forward because Helen believed houses survived trouble by refusing to become dramatic. Annie worked quietly, but her thoughts stayed downtown, inside the Whitmore Global boardroom she had never seen. Somewhere in that building, Richard would place the evidence before people who once trusted Martin Blake. Not enough to convict him. Not yet, but enough to stop him from taking control. Marla came into the kitchen with an empty basket under one arm. "You folded that napkin 3 times. Annie looked down. It didn't look right. It looked rich. That's usually enough. Helen entered before Annie could answer. "Marla, if you have time to judge linen, you have time to check the upstairs towels." I was encouraging the girl. "You were talking. They are not always related." Marla left with the basket, muttering something about towels having more rights than people. Annie kept her eyes down, but Helen saw the tension in her shoulders. "Stop trying to hear a board meeting from 20 miles away," Helen said. "I'm not." "You are. You are just doing it with napkins." Annie set the linen down. "What if they don't believe him?" Helen poured tea into 2 mugs, one for herself and one for Annie. "Then they ask more questions. What if Mr. Blake already has answers?" "People like Mr. Blake always have answers. The trouble comes when someone asks the question he did not prepare for." Annie wrapped her fingers around the mug. "I keep thinking I should have noticed more." "You noticed enough to start the right people moving. Enough may not be enough." Helen sat across from her. "Miss Carter, there is a lesson you had better learn before this house teaches it the hard way. Responsibility is not the same as ownership. You are responsible for telling the truth as clearly as you can. You do not own what powerful people do with it." Annie looked toward the hallway. "That sounds good." "It is not meant to sound good. It is meant to keep you from carrying a house on your back." Before Annie could respond, the front gate intercom buzzed. Helen rose and went to the wall panel near the rear hall. "Yes?" A man's voice came through. "Package for Miss Annie Carter." Annie's hand froze around the mug. Helen did not look at her yet. "From whom?" "Courier drop-off." "No sender listed. No delivery accepted without sender identification. Leave." The man hesitated. "Ma'am, I was paid to, and now you are being told to leave. Good day." Helen released the button and turned. "You were not expecting anything?" "No, ma'am." Helen went to the front hall and spoke briefly to the security guard through the house phone. Annie stayed at the table, pulse steady but quick. A package with her name. Not Richard's. Not Helen's. Hers. That meant whoever was behind the message had found more than her email. Mrs. Whitmore entered the kitchen in a pale blue sweater, her hair pinned back, her expression controlled in a way that made the room feel colder. "What was that?" Helen answered. "A courier with an unidentified package for Miss Carter. I refused it." Mrs. Whitmore looked at Annie. "Did you order anything?" "No, ma'am. I did not think so." The house phone rang. Helen answered, listened, then said, "Bring it to the mudroom. Do not open it." She hung up. The courier left it by the gate before driving off. Mrs. Whitmore's face hardened. "Call David." "I already am." Annie stood. "I can leave the room." "No," Mrs. Whitmore said. The word was not warm, but it was firm. Annie sat back down. The security guard brought the package to the mudroom in a plastic evidence bag from his station, following Helen's instructions. It was a small, padded envelope with Annie's name printed on a white label. No return address, no postage, hand-delivered. Helen placed it on the mudroom counter and did not touch it again. David answered on speaker from downtown. His voice came through clipped and alert. "Do not open it. Photograph it. Security logs. Camera footage. I'll send someone to collect it. Mrs. Whitmore stood beside Helen. Is Richard in the meeting? Yes. Does he know? Not yet. I will tell him when it does not risk interrupting testimony. Annie caught the word. Testimony? David paused. Patricia is presenting findings to the board, not legal testimony. Formal review language. Mrs. Whitmore asked, how is it going? David was quiet for a moment. Martin is pushing back hard. Evelyn is listening. That is better than yesterday. The call ended. Helen photographed the envelope without moving it. Mrs. Whitmore sent the images to David. Annie watched from the doorway, feeling the strange distance between her name on that label and her body standing in the house. Someone was trying to pull her into the center of the story, not because she was powerful, because she was easy to question. Mrs. Whitmore turned to her. You are not to blame for this. Annie nodded, but the answer did not reach her face. I said you are not to blame. I heard you, ma'am. Hearing is not believing. Annie looked at the envelope. People don't send packages like that unless they want someone scared. Helen said, then let them be disappointed. At noon, Richard called the house. Mrs. Whitmore took it in the study, with Helen beside her and Annie waiting in the hall because leaving seemed worse than staying. The door was not fully closed. Richard's voice came through low. The board approved full independent review. Martin's vendor authority is frozen. Mrs. Whitmore closed her eyes briefly. Good. He objected. Called Patricia's findings incomplete. Suggested David was allowing household confusion to influence corporate judgment. Household confusion, she repeated. Is that what we are calling courage now? He also raised Annie again. Annie's hands tightened. Richard continued. Evelyn shut him down. Said if his defense required attacking temporary household staff, his defense was already wandering. Helen's mouth shifted with satisfaction. Mrs. Whitmore asked, did you tell him about the package? David told me after the vote. Security will handle it. Keep Annie inside. She is inside. There was a pause. Then Richard said, let me speak to her. Mrs. Whitmore looked toward the hall. Annie. Annie stepped into the study and took the phone because Mrs. Whitmore held it out. Yes, sir? Are you all right? The question sounded strange coming from him. It was plain, almost rough, as if he had not used it often. Yes, sir. That was not a report. Try again. Annie looked at Helen, then at Mrs. Whitmore. Both women waited. I'm scared, she said, but I'm all right. Richard was silent for half a second. Good. Scared keeps people careful. It should not make decisions for them. Yes, sir. The board froze Martin's authority. I heard. You helped make that possible. I only answered questions. Do not shrink the truth just because it makes you uncomfortable. Annie did not know what to say, so she said the one thing she could still stand behind. Then I'm glad the papers held. They held, Richard said. Now we see what he does when they start closing doors. After the call, the house moved differently. Not lighter, not safe, but less helpless. The board had not cleared Richard. Martin had not been exposed fully. The package still sat sealed in the mudroom, waiting for David's investigator. But Martin had reached for the keys and missed. That afternoon, Annie returned to the library under Helen's supervision, not to sort confidential papers but to box old magazines for storage. Mrs. Whitmore came in near 3 and stood by the window. Miss Carter, she said. Annie set a magazine down. Yes, ma'am? Before all this, I thought my husband had made an impulsive mistake bringing you here. Annie stayed quiet. I still think it was impulsive. Helen looked up from the table. Mrs. Whitmore continued, but I no longer think it was a mistake. Annie felt those words settle somewhere she did not have a name for. Thank you, ma'am. Mrs. Whitmore nodded once and left before the moment could become too soft. Helen waited until the footsteps faded. That was practically a parade. Annie almost smiled. From her? With fireworks. By evening, David's investigator collected the package. The contents, reported by phone 2 hours later, were not physically dangerous. Inside was a printed photo taken through the cafe window the night Richard met Annie, showing her standing at his table with a laptop in her arms. Across the image, someone had written in black marker, "Ask what she wants from him." Richard returned home after 9. He entered through the front door, removed his coat, and stood in the hall with David's message still open on his phone. Annie was carrying folded towels to the rear stairs. She stopped when she saw him. He looked tired, but the cold control was back in place, not aimed at her, aimed outward. "Miss Carter," he said. "Yes, sir. If anyone asks what you want from me, what will you say?" Annie held the towels against her chest. A job. A roof until I can pay. And the chance to finish what I started, without being made into someone else's excuse. Richard nodded slowly. Good answer. It's the true one. That is why it is good. He walked toward the study, then stopped. Tomorrow, David will bring you a written temporary employment agreement. Pay, duties, housing terms, clear boundaries. If your name is going to be dragged toward my company, we make your place here clean on paper. Annie stared at him. You don't have to do that. Yes, Richard said. I do. He left her in the hall with the towels, and for the first time since she entered the Whitmore house, Annie felt the difference between being sheltered and being acknowledged. Upstairs later, she opened her spreadsheet and added a new line. Written agreement tomorrow. Not charity. Terms. She paused, then added one more. A clean place on paper can protect a person when whispers start looking for dirt. Downstairs, Richard sat in his study and opened the bottom drawer. The old photograph of him and Martin lay inside, face down. He did not touch it. Instead, he opened a fresh folder and wrote Annie Carter across the tab. Not as a secret. As a record, the employment agreement arrived the next morning in a plain folder, not in Richard's hand, but in David Langford's. That mattered to Annie. A gift could be taken back by mood. A document had edges. It could be read, questioned, signed, filed. It could protect both sides from pretending later that generosity had been enough. Helen set the folder on the staff table after breakfast and placed a pen beside it. Read before signing. Annie wiped her hands on a dish towel. All of it? All of it, David said from the doorway, especially the parts that look boring. Boring language is where people hide hooks. Marla leaned over just enough to see the first page. Temporary residential household employment agreement. Lord, even kindness needs a necktie in this house. Helen gave her a look. Laundry. I'm going. Annie sat and read. The agreement named her as temporary household staff, assigned to Helen Morris. It listed the attic room as part of the arrangement. Not charity. It gave her hourly pay for household duties, clear work hours, meal access during shifts, privacy in the attic room, and the right to leave with notice. It also stated she was not employed by Whitmore Global, had no corporate duties, and would not be asked to handle company records unless supervised by legal counsel. There was a repayment option for housing costs, capped and scheduled only after she obtained outside income. She read that line twice. Richard entered the kitchen while she was still reading. He had his coat over one arm and Annie looked up. The repayment cap. What about it? It is too low. David removed his glasses. It is reasonable. It is not what the room is worth. Richard's voice stayed even. You are not renting a luxury room. You are staying in an attic under employment terms. It is still a room in this house. Helen poured coffee without looking at her. Miss Carter, do not negotiate against yourself before 9 in the morning. Annie kept her eyes on Richard. I said I would pay back rent. And I said we would discuss it, Richard replied. This is the discussion. You are making it easy. No, I am making it clean. The word stopped her. Clean. On paper. In a house where old paper had carried so much dirt. Clean suddenly meant more than kindness. David pushed the pen closer. You may request changes. Annie looked down again. I want one. Richard waited. If I help with any document review, even only under supervision, I want that recorded separately. I don't want anyone later saying I was just a maid touching things I shouldn't touch. Mrs. Whitmore had entered quietly from the hall. At Annie's words, she stopped beside Helen. For once, she did not interrupt. David nodded slowly. That is a smart request. Richard looked at him. At it. David took the folder back, wrote a note on the top page, and said, I'll revise the clause. It will state that any archive-related assistance is at the request of counsel, supervised, limited, and documented. Annie breathed out. Thank you. Richard studied her for a moment. Anything else? She almost said no. Then she looked at Mrs. Whitmore, then at Helen, then back at Richard. Yes. I want my pay recorded from the first full day I worked. Not from today. Marla, halfway through the rear hall with a laundry basket, whispered, That's right. Helen did not correct her. David made another note. Fair. Richard gave one short nod. Done. Mrs. Whitmore finally spoke, and I want a security note added. She is not to answer the gate, front phone, or outside inquiries. Not because she is incapable, but but because she is being targeted. David wrote again. Also fair. Annie looked at her. Thank you, ma'am. Mrs. Whitmore's face remained composed. Do not thank me for being late to decency. Nobody knew what to say to that, so Helen said, toast is getting cold, and the room found its way back to movement. By noon, the revised agreement was signed. Annie's name looked small at the bottom of the page, but it was hers. David made 3 copies. One for his file, one for Richard, one for Annie. Helen gave